Welcome, weary hollow, to the twilight of the age of fire. Tonight, we journey through the fading embers of a dying world, where four ancient beings once ruled over domains of light and shadow, life and death. This is the story of the Lords of Cinder Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, the Witch of Izalith, Grave Lord Nito, and the furtive pygmy, whose choices shaped the very foundations of existence itself. Settle into the comfortable darkness. Let the bonfire's warmth embrace you, and allow your mind to drift through these ancient halls where gods once walked. There's no need to fight the encroaching sleep. Simply rest. In the beginning, before the concepts of light and dark had any meaning, before time itself had learned to flow in the patterns we now understand as natural law, there existed a world of perfect, terrible stillness. This was the Age of Ancients, a time so removed from our current understanding of existence that even attempting to describe it requires us to abandon the very notions of beginning and ending, of change and growth, of life and death. The world in those primordial days was a realm of grey stone and perpetual twilight, where massive arch trees stretched toward a colourless sky like the pillars of some cosmic cathedral. These ancient giants, neither truly alive nor dead in any sense we might comprehend, served as the foundation for all existence, their intertwined roots and branches creating the very architecture upon which reality itself was constructed. The stone was not the familiar rock we know today, worn smooth by wind and water, shaped by the patient work of geological ages. Instead, it was something far more fundamental, the raw substance of creation itself, unmarked by time, because time had not yet learned to leave its signature upon the world. These grey crags rose and fell in patterns that suggested vast purpose without revealing their meaning, as if the world itself were a sculpture left unfinished by some cosmic artist who had stepped away from their work for an eternity. Between the mighty arch trees, in the spaces where their ancient branches failed to interweave, there existed pockets of perfect void, not the absence of something that had once been there, but rather the presence of absolute nothingness, areas where existence had simply chosen not to manifest. These gaps served as windows into the fundamental nature of the primordial world, revealing the delicate balance between being and non-being that characterized everything in those distant days. Above this landscape of stone and wood and emptiness, the everlasting dragons held dominion over all creation. These beings were not creatures in any conventional sense, for they transcended the very categories that would later define life itself. They possessed no birth, knowing no beginning to their existence, and they faced no death, having never learned that endings were possible. They simply were, as eternal and unchanging as the grey stone beneath their feet and the colourless sky above their heads. The dragons were magnificent in their alien perfection, their forms embodying concepts that would later fracture into the dualities that define our world. They were neither large nor small, for size had no meaning in a realm where nothing grew or diminished. They were neither ancient nor young, for age could not touch beings who existed outside the flow of time. They were simply present, as much a part of the landscape as the arch trees themselves. Their scales, the same unchanging grey as everything else in that timeless realm. Their immortality was not the desperate clinging to life that would characterize later attempts to cheat death, nor was it the divine transcendence that gods would one day claim as their birthright. Instead, it was something far more fundamental, the complete absence of the very concept of mortality. The dragons could not die because death did not exist, could not change because change was unknown, could not grow or learn or love or hate because all of these things required the passage of time and the possibility of alteration. In this world of perfect stasis, The dragons served as both rulers and symbols of the eternal order. They moved through their domain with the slow, deliberate grace of beings who had no destination because they had all the time in the world to reach it. Their great wings beat with rhythms that had remained unchanged since the first moment of existence, creating currents in the still air that followed patterns as ancient and immutable as the movements of celestial bodies. The intelligence that dwelt behind their ancient eyes was vast and alien, encompassing understanding that would be impossible for any mind shaped by growth and change to fully comprehend. They knew every stone of their domain, every branch of every arch tree, every pattern of shadow cast by their own eternal flight. Yet this knowledge was not learned but simply possessed, as natural and unremarkable as their own existence. There was peace in this world, the perfect peace of absolute stillness, but it was not the peace of contentment or satisfaction. Instead, it was the peace of a clock that has stopped ticking, of a river that has frozen solid, of a song that plays the same note for all eternity without variation or resolution. It was peace without joy, order without purpose, perfection without meaning. Yet even in this realm of apparent, unchanging eternity, something stirred in the deepest places, something that would eventually grow into the force that would reshape everything. Deep beneath the grey stone, in caverns so far removed from the surface world that they seemed to exist in a different dimension entirely, there flickered the first faint hint of something unprecedented disparity. This was not yet the dramatic flame that would later illuminate the world with its brilliant fire, but rather the most subtle suggestion that perhaps absolute uniformity need not be the only way of existence. In the darkness below, in places where even the everlasting dragons never ventured, the seeds of change were slowly taking root in soil that had never before known the possibility of growth. The disparity began as nothing more than the faintest variation in the grey sameness that characterized everything in the world above. Where once there had been perfect uniformity, now there appeared the most minute differences, shadows that were perhaps slightly darker than their surroundings, stones that might have been imperceptibly different in texture, spaces between the roots of the arch trees that seemed to whisper with the possibility of something other than eternal silence. These changes were so subtle that even the all-seeing eyes of the dragons failed to notice them, for the ancient lords of the sky were accustomed to a world where nothing ever changed, and therefore had no reason to look for signs of alteration. The perfect order they had maintained since time immemorial continued unchanged on the surface, while far below, in the forgotten depths where their dominion had never extended, the impossible slowly began to make itself possible. As the ages passed, though age itself was still a concept without meaning in a world where time moved in circles rather than lines, the disparity grew stronger and more pronounced. What had begun as the faintest suggestion of difference gradually developed into something that might almost be called variation, then diversity, then finally into something approaching true change. The darkness below began to take on qualities that distinguished it from the grey twilight above, where the surface world knew only a single, unchanging shade of colourless existence. The depths started to develop subtle gradations of shadow and gloom, creating the first primitive spectrum of experience that the world had ever known. It was still far from the brilliant rainbow of possibilities that fire would eventually bring, but it represented the crucial first step away from absolute uniformity. In certain deep places, where the pressure of stone above had created caverns of particular resonance, these variations in darkness began to coalesce into something approaching concentration. The disparity that had been spread thin throughout the depths slowly gathered itself into focal points of change, areas where the very nature of existence seemed to bend and warp under the weight of unprecedented possibility. And in the deepest place of all, In a cavern so far beneath the surface that it seemed to exist at the very foundation of the world itself, the accumulated disparity finally reached a critical threshold. In that moment, in that place, the impossible became inevitable, and the Age of Ancients began its long, slow march toward its own ending. The change, when it finally came, was both dramatic and subtle, earth-shaking and whisper-quiet. It announced itself not with thunder or lightning, for such dramatic displays would come later, when fire had taught the world to express itself in bold strokes, but with the simple, profound fact of its own existence. Where once there had been only grey uniformity, now there burned something unprecedented, something that had never before existed in all the long eternity of the ancient world. It was a flame, but calling it merely fire would be like calling the ocean merely water or the sky merely air. This was the first flame, the original spark of disparity, the source from which all future change would flow. It burned with colors that had no names, because color itself was being born in its radiance, cast shadows that danced with patterns of light and dark, that introduced the very concepts of illumination and obscurity to a world that had known only the grey sameness of eternal twilight. The flame was small, no larger than might be cupped in mortal hands, yet it contained within itself possibilities that dwarfed the infinite expanse of the ancient world above. Its light reached outward through the deep caverns like the roots of some cosmic tree, touching stone that had never known warmth, illuminating spaces that had existed in absolute darkness since the beginning of time. And in that touching and illuminating, it began the great work of transformation that would reshape everything. For in the presence of the first flame, the very nature of existence began to shift and change. The perfect, sterile immortality of the Age of Ancients started to give way to something far more complex and dangerous. The possibility of growth and decay, of beginning and ending, of life and death. The flame burned with the power to create and destroy in equal measure, offering both the promise of transcendent joy and the threat of ultimate annihilation. And drawn to this impossible fire like moths to a candle, there came from the depths of the world beings that had never before existed, hollow creatures that were neither dragon nor archtree, neither stone nor void, but something entirely new. These were the ancestors of what would one day become humanity, and the gods themselves. Though in their original form they possessed nothing that would suggest such glorious destinies, they were empty, these hollow ones, vessels waiting to be filled with purpose and meaning that they had not yet learned to name. They approached the first flame with instincts they did not understand, drawn by needs they could not articulate, seeking something they had no words to describe. In their eyes burned a hunger that was as new to the world as the flame itself, the desire for change, for growth, for something beyond the endless grey stasis that had defined all existence until this pivotal moment. The stage was set, the ancient world balanced on the knife's edge between what it had always been and what it might become. Above, the everlasting dragons continued their eternal flights through changeless skies, unaware that far below them, the very foundations of their timeless realm were beginning to shift. The Age of Ancients, which had seemed as permanent and unalterable as the grey stone itself, was about to give way to something unprecedented, something wonderful and terrible in equal measure. The first flame burned in its deep cavern, waiting for the moment when hollow hands would reach out to claim the power it offered, waiting for the birth of lords and gods, and all the glorious, tragic stories that would flow from that moment of reaching. The ancient world held its breath, though it had never needed to breathe before, and prepared for the transformation that would make all things new. In the depths beneath the ancient world, where the first flame burned with its impossible radiance, there gathered the hollow beings who would soon become the architects of a new age. Among them moved one whose destiny would shine brighter than all others, whose choices would illuminate the world for countless eons, and whose name would be spoken with reverence long after the flame itself had dimmed to ember and ash. This was the being who would become known as Gwyn, though in those primordial days he possessed no name, no identity beyond the hollow vessel that he shared with all his kind. Yet even then, there was something that set him apart from the others who approached the flame, a presence that seemed to draw light to itself, an inner radiance that had not yet learned to express itself but yearned for the moment when it could blaze forth in all its glory. When Gwyn reached toward the first flame, when his hollow fingers finally made contact with that impossible fire, the transformation that followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The flame seemed to recognize in him a kindred spirit, a being capable of bearing the tremendous burden and glorious privilege that came with its most precious gift. From the dancing fires emerged a soul of such brilliance that it seemed to contain within itself the very essence of illumination. This was the Lord Soul of Light, the most radiant and powerful of all the souls that the first flame would offer to those brave or foolish enough to claim them. It burned within Gwyn's newly awakened consciousness like a miniature sun, filling the hollow spaces of his existence with purpose and power that transformed him from empty vessel to divine being in a single moment of transcendent contact. The light that now dwelt within him was not merely brightness, but something far more fundamental, the capacity to drive back darkness, to create order from chaos, to establish law, where before there had been only the grey uniformity of eternal stasis. It was the power to lead and to inspire, to build civilizations that would endure across the ages, and to serve as a beacon of hope in times when all seemed lost to shadow. Yet with this incredible gift came responsibilities that would define every moment of Gwyn's existence from that day forward. The Lord Soul of Light was not simply power to be wielded, but a sacred trust to be honored, a divine mandate to serve as the guardian of order and the enemy of entropy. He had become something greater than mortal, yet the weight of immortal purpose would prove to be both his greatest strength and his ultimate tragedy. From the caverns where his transformation had taken place, Gwyn emerged into a world that seemed suddenly small and grey compared to the brilliant visions that now filled his consciousness. The ancient realm of dragons and archtrees, which had once encompassed all of existence, now appeared to him as merely the foundation upon which something far grander could be built. The unchanging grey stone called out to be shaped into monuments of gleaming beauty, while the colourless skies seemed to yearn for the golden radiance that only he could provide. With the power of his Lord Soul flowing through him like liquid starlight, Gwyn began the great work that would define the rest of his existence, the establishment of a realm worthy of the light he bore within him. Yet he understood, with wisdom born from his newfound divinity, that such an undertaking could not be accomplished through power alone. Even a Lord Soul, for all its tremendous might, required vision and purpose to guide its expression. And so Gwyn set about creating not merely a kingdom, but a new form of existence itself, one that would embody the principles of order, beauty, and eternal radiance that his soul represented. This would be Aenor Londo, the city of the gods, a realm so magnificent that its very existence would serve as proof that the age of ancients had given way to something immeasurably greater. The construction of Aenor Londo was not accomplished through conventional building methods, for no mortal tools could have shaped the vision that burned within Gwyn's divine consciousness. Instead, he used the power of his Lord Soul to literally reshape reality itself. calling forth from the grey stone structures of such beauty and grandeur that they seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some higher dimension of pure aesthetic perfection. The city rose from the mountainous heights on foundations of white stone that seemed to glow with their own inner light, its towers and spires reaching toward the heavens as if trying to touch the source of all illumination. Every arch and buttress was shaped according to mathematical principles that spoke of divine harmony, while every window and doorway was positioned to capture and reflect the golden radiance that flowed from Gwyn himself like an endless river of liquid sunshine. At the heart of this magnificent city, Gwyn established his great cathedral, a structure so vast and awe-inspiring that it seemed to dwarf even the mighty arch trees of the ancient world. Its soaring ceiling disappeared into heights that challenged the very concept of architectural limitation, while its columns were carved from single pieces of stone so perfectly white they seemed to have been shaped from crystallized light itself. Within this sacred space, Gwyn placed his throne not a seat of political power, but an altar to the principle of divine order that he represented. The throne was carved from a single massive crystal that had been shaped by forces beyond mortal understanding, its faceted surface capturing and multiplying the light that radiated from the Lord of Sunlight until the entire cathedral blazed with radiance that could be seen from incredible distances. Yet even as he shaped his perfect city and established his divine throne, Gwyn understood that true lordship required more than magnificent architecture or displays of power. A realm built on light and order needed inhabitants who could embody these same principles, beings who could serve as extensions of his will while possessing the wisdom and strength necessary to maintain the civilization he was creating. From his own essence, using the creative power of his Lord's soul, Gwyn brought forth the beings who would become his family and his greatest treasures. First came Guinevere, the Princess of Sunlight, whose beauty and grace would serve as the living embodiment of all that was gentle and nurturing in the power of light. She possessed her father's radiance but expressed it through compassion and healing rather than dominion and command. Guinevere's laughter rang through the halls of Anor Londo like the sound of crystal bells, while her presence brought warmth and joy to even the most solemn ceremonial occasions. She became the patron of miracles and healing, her power capable of mending not only physical wounds but also the spiritual injuries that could affect even divine beings. In her, Gwyn saw the proof that power and gentleness could coexist, that strength could be expressed through nurturing as effectively as through conquest. Then came Gwyndolin, the dark sun, whose nature would always set him apart from the golden radiance that characterized the rest of his family. Born under the influence of the moon rather than the sun, Gwyndolin possessed magic that drew from lunar forces and shadow, creating a connection to aspects of existence that Gwyn himself could never fully understand or control. Yet rather than rejecting his unusual son or attempting to force him into a more conventional mold, Gwyn recognized that Gwyndolin's different gifts served an essential purpose in the divine order. Light without shadow becomes blinding, while day without night loses all meaning. Gwyndolin became the keeper of ancient magics and hidden knowledge, the guardian of secrets too dangerous for common understanding, and the bridge between his father's realm of pure radiance and the darker mysteries that existed beyond the reach of conventional illumination. The third of Gwyn's divine children was the one whose story would become both the most glorious and the most tragic of all. This was the Nameless King, the firstborn son whose prowess in battle and mastery of lightning made him the greatest warrior in all of Anor Londo. In him, Gwyn saw the perfect fusion of divine power and martial excellence, a being who could serve as both protector of the realm and symbol of its military might. The nameless king commanded storms as easily as others might wield swords, his spear crackling with lightning that could split mountains, and his presence on the battlefield inspiring such confidence in his allies that they fought with courage that bordered on the supernatural. He was everything Gwyn had dreamed. His heir might be noble, powerful, and absolutely dedicated to the principles of order and justice that formed the foundation of their divine realm. Yet this same son would one day make choices that would break his father's heart and lead to his name being stricken from every record, every monument, every memory of Anor Londo's golden age. The bonds between father and son, no matter how strong, would prove insufficient to overcome fundamental differences in philosophy and purpose that neither could have foreseen in those early days of divine glory. Beyond his immediate family, Gwyn gathered around himself a court of beings who embodied the highest ideals of the age he was creating. These were his knights, warriors, and servants, whose dedication to the cause of light and order elevated them from mere followers to living symbols of divine purpose. Each possessed abilities that reflected different aspects of Gwyn's own nature, creating a pantheon of champions whose combined might could face any challenge that might threaten their golden realm. Chief among these knights was Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, whose mastery of lightning and unwavering loyalty made him the perfect captain for Gwyn's elite guard. Ornstein's spear had tasted the blood of ancient dragons during the Great War that would come, while his golden armor reflected his lord's radiance in ways that made him appear to be carved from solid sunlight. In battle, he moved with speed that seemed to defy natural law, his attacks preceded by crackling bolts of divine lightning that announced the arrival of Gwyn's justice to any who would dare oppose it. Alongside Ornstein served other knights whose names would become legendary throughout the age. Artorius of the Abyss, whose greatness would be measured not only by his victories, but by his ultimate sacrifice in the face of darkness. Kiaran, the Lord's Blade, whose skill with curved swords was matched only by her absolute dedication to her sworn duties. And Hawkeye Goff, the giant archer whose arrows could strike targets from distances that challenged the very concept of ranged combat. Together, these knights formed a brotherhood of purpose that transcended mere military organization. They were the living embodiment of Gwyn's ideals. Warriors whose very existence proved that power could be wielded in service of noble causes, that strength could be guided by wisdom, and that even divine beings could find meaning through service to principles greater than themselves. Under their protection and guidance, Anor Londo flourished as a center of learning, art, and spiritual development. The city's libraries contained knowledge that had been gathered from across the known world, while its workshops produced miracles of craftsmanship that seemed to blur the line between mortal skill and divine intervention. Scholars came from distant lands to study in institutions where human wisdom was enhanced by divine insight, while artisans worked with materials that had been blessed by Gwyn's own radiance. The establishment of the Way of White represented perhaps Gwyn's most ambitious attempt to extend his influence beyond the boundaries of his divine city. This religious order was designed to carry the principles of light and order to mortal communities throughout the world, spreading the gospel of civilization and law to peoples who had never before experienced organized society. The clerics of the Way of White were trained not merely as religious functionaries, but as teachers, healers, and organizers capable of establishing the infrastructure necessary for stable communities. They carried with them knowledge of agriculture and medicine, law and governance, art and philosophy, all the tools necessary to lift mortal societies from primitive subsistence to something approaching the glory of Anor Londo itself. Yet even as the Way of White spread Gwyn's influence throughout the mortal world, it also represented a fundamental limitation in his understanding of the nature of existence. The Lord of Sunlight had created a system based on the assumption that light and order were inherently superior to darkness and chaos, that all beings would naturally prefer the stability and beauty of his divine realm to the uncertainty and danger of the untamed world. This philosophy, while noble in its intentions, failed to account for the fundamental role that darkness played in the natural order of things. Light without shadow becomes meaningless, while order without the possibility of chaos loses all significance. By attempting to create a world of pure radiance, Gwyn was unconsciously setting the stage for conflicts that would ultimately threaten everything he had built. The daily life of Anor Londo during its golden age was structured around rituals and ceremonies that celebrated the glory of divine light, while reinforcing the social order that kept everything functioning smoothly. Each day began with the lighting of the braziers, when Gwyn himself would kindle the great fires that illuminated the city and provided warmth for its inhabitants. This was not merely a practical necessity, but a sacred act that reaffirmed his role as the source of all illumination and order. The great cathedral served as the center for communal worship, where gathered beings, both divine and mortal, would join their voices in hymns of praise that celebrated the triumph of light over darkness. These ceremonies were not mere displays of devotion, but carefully structured rituals designed to channel and focus the collective spiritual energy of the participants, creating harmony that resonated throughout the entire realm. Yet, beneath the surface beauty and apparent perfection of Anor Londo, there stirred currents of complexity that would eventually challenge every assumption upon which Gwyn's realm was built. The Lord of Sunlight, for all his wisdom and power, was still a being who had been shaped by the fundamental limitations of his nature. He could no more truly understand darkness than darkness could comprehend light, and this inability to grasp the full spectrum of existence would prove to be both his greatest strength and his ultimate weakness. The seeds of future tragedy were already present in those golden days, though none who walked the shining streets of Anor Londo could have imagined how drastically their perfect world would one day change. The first flame that had given birth to disparity burned bright and steady, but flames by their very nature are not eternal. Even the most glorious fire must eventually consume all available fuel, and when that day came, even the Lord of Sunlight would be forced to make choices that would define not only his own fate, but the destiny of all existence. For now, though, there was only glory and radiance, only the eternal golden afternoon of divine perfection that seemed as though it might last forever. Gwyn sat upon his crystal throne, surrounded by the family and followers who embodied his highest ideals, ruling over a realm where every stone reflected his radiance, and every shadow served only to enhance the beauty of the light that banished it. He was lord of all he surveyed, master of forces that could reshape reality itself, the living embodiment of order and civilization. Yet even in this moment of supreme triumph, deep in his divine consciousness, there flickered the first faint awareness that perfection itself might carry within it the seeds of its own transformation. The wheel of fate was already beginning to turn, though so slowly that even immortal eyes could not yet perceive its movement. The Age of Fire burned bright and glorious, but ages, like flames, are not eternal things. In the deepest places beneath the ancient world, where the first flame had birthed disparity and possibility from the grey uniformity of eternal stasis, there dwelt another who would claim a soul of tremendous power from that impossible fire. Yet where Gwyn had been drawn to radiance and order, this being felt called to something far different, the warm, creative force that brought forth life itself from the raw materials of existence. This was she who would become known as the Witch of Izalith, though like all the Hollow Ones who approached the flame, She possessed no name or identity in those primordial moments when everything was still taking shape. What set her apart from her companions was not ambition or hunger for power, but rather a deep, instinctive understanding of the creative principle that burned at the heart of the first flame, the capacity to nurture and grow, to bring forth new forms of existence where before there had been only emptiness. When her hollow hands finally made contact with the dancing fire, when the flame recognized in her a kindred spirit of creation and growth, there emerged from the depths of that impossible combustion a soul that pulsed with the very rhythm of life itself. This was the life soul, the witch's lord soul, a fragment of the first flame that contained within itself the power to kindle not just fire but all the myriad forms of existence that fire could inspire and sustain. The transformation that followed was unlike any that had been witnessed before, for while Gwyn's metamorphosis had been a blazing assertion of divine authority, the witch's change was something altogether more subtle and profound. The life soul did not simply fill the hollow spaces of her existence, but transformed them entirely, creating new capacities for understanding and creation that had never before existed in any living being. Where others saw only fire, she perceived the infinite possibilities contained within each dancing flame, the potential for warmth that could nurture growth, for light that could guide lost travelers, for energy that could power the great works of civilization. Her consciousness expanded to encompass not just the immediate presence of the flame, but its relationship to all living things, the complex web of connections that bound fire to earth, air to water, and life to the very essence of existence itself. The power that now flowed through her was not the commanding radiance of lordship, but something far more intimate and essential. The ability to understand fire not as a tool of dominion, but as a partner in the great work of creation. She could speak to flames as others might converse with friends, could coax from even the smallest ember performances of such beauty and complexity that they seemed to possess personalities of their own. From the deep caverns where her transformation had taken place, the witch emerged into a world that suddenly revealed itself to be filled with possibilities for growth and creation that she had never before imagined. The grey stone called out to be warmed into fertility, while the still air yearned for the breath of life that only her newfound powers could provide. She saw in the unchanging landscape of the ancient world not a realm of sterile perfection, but a canvas waiting for the artist's touch. The domain she chose to claim as her own reflected both her nature and her aspirations. A vast underground realm where lava flows and volcanic activity had created chambers of such natural beauty that they seemed designed specifically for Ode, someone with her unique gifts. This was Izalith, the city of fire and life, a place where the raw creative power of flame could be studied, refined, and channeled toward purposes that would benefit all existence. Unlike Anor Londo, with its emphasis on architectural grandeur and divine authority, Izalith grew organically from the volcanic landscape, its structures seeming to emerge naturally from the living rock rather than being imposed upon it. The witch used her powers not to reshape reality according to some predetermined vision, but to guide and nurture the natural processes of growth and change, allowing the city to develop according to its own inner logic rather than forcing it into artificial patterns. The chambers of Izalith pulsed with warm, red light that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of some great heart, while pools of molten rock served not as obstacles to be overcome, but as sources of energy and inspiration for the incredible works that would emerge from this unique realm. The architecture itself seemed alive, with walls that radiated gentle heat and floors that held the warmth of summer earth even in the deepest winter of the soul. At the heart of her domain, the witch established not a throne room like Gwyn's cathedral, but a great laboratory where the mysteries of fire and life could be explored with the dedication and reverence they deserved. This was a place of learning and experimentation, where the fundamental principles that governed the relationship between flame and existence could be studied and understood through careful observation and inspired creativity. The tools of her research were not conventional instruments, but flames themselves, carefully cultivated fires that had been nurtured and trained to perform specific functions in the great work of understanding. Each flame possessed its own character and capabilities, from tiny sparks that could reveal the deepest secrets of molecular structure to roaring bonfires that could illuminate the grandest patterns of cosmic harmony. Yet the witch did not work alone in her great laboratory, for from her own essence, she brought forth companions who could share in her vision and assist in the monumental task she had set for herself. These were her daughters, beings of fire and wisdom, who embodied different aspects of their mother's nature while possessing their own unique gifts and perspectives on the mysteries they sought to unravel. The daughters of chaos, as they would come to be known, were marvels of creation that demonstrated the full scope of the witch's power and understanding. Each was shaped according to principles that reflected deep truths about the nature of fire and life, their forms expressing in physical reality concepts that existed at the very foundation of existence itself. Some of her daughters manifested as beings of pure flame, their bodies crackling with energy that could warm a castle or melt steel depending upon their mood and intention. Others took forms that blended fire with more conventional matter, creating creatures of such beauty and grace that they seemed to have stepped out of dreams of perfect artistic expression. All possessed intelligence that burned as brightly as their physical flames, minds capable of grasping complexities that would have challenged even the wisest scholars of later ages. Together, the witch and her daughters began the work that would define their civilization for ages to come: the systematic study and development of pyromancy, the art of controlling and directing fire through will and understanding rather than mere force. This was not simply magic in the conventional sense, but a whole new way of relating to the fundamental forces of existence, a philosophy that treated fire as a partner in creation rather than a tool to be wielded. The pyromancy that emerged from Izalith was unlike any magical tradition that would develop in later ages. Where other forms of sorcery sought to impose the practitioner's will upon reality through formulaic spells and rigid procedures, the fire magic of the witch's domain was based on cooperation and mutual respect between flame and wielder. Each act of pyromancy was a collaboration, a dance between human intention and elemental force that could produce results far beyond what either partner could achieve alone. The pyromancers who studied under the witch's guidance learned to see fire not as a destructive force to be feared and controlled, but as a creative partner, capable of infinite subtlety and expression. They could coax flames to burn in colors that had no names, to take shapes that defied geometric logic, to produce warmth without light or illumination, without heat, according to the specific needs of each situation. More than mere magical techniques, these pyromantic arts represented a complete philosophy of existence that emphasized growth, change, and creative transformation over the static perfection that characterized other divine realms. Where Gwyn's Arnor Londo celebrated eternal order and unchanging beauty, Izalith embraced the dynamic processes of life itself: birth and death, growth and decay, transformation and renewal, in endless cycles that reflected the dancing flames from which all their power flowed. The culture that developed in Izalith was one of scholars and artists, innovators and dreamers who saw in fire not just a source of power, but a teacher whose lessons could guide them toward ever greater understanding of the mysteries of existence. They built workshops where flame and metal danced together to create works of such craftsmanship that they seemed to possess souls of their own. libraries where the knowledge of fire was recorded in books that were themselves made from materials that had been transformed by careful application of pyromantic arts. The gardens of Izalith were marvels that demonstrated the witch's mastery of the life-giving properties of controlled fire. Here grew plants that had never existed in the grey world above, vegetation that had been nurtured into existence through the careful application of flame and will. Some flowers bloomed with petals that glowed like embers, their beauty enhanced by the gentle heat they radiated, while others produced fruits that could warm the body and nourish the soul with flavors that seemed to contain within themselves the very essence of comfort and satisfaction. The streets of the city were lit not by torches or braziers, but by flames that had been convinced to take permanent residence in crystal containers that had been shaped specifically for their comfort and convenience. These living lights provided illumination that was warm and welcoming rather than harsh and demanding, creating an atmosphere that invited contemplation and conversation rather than commanding attention through mere brightness. Yet for all its wonders and innovations, Izalith was not a realm that existed in isolation from the greater world. The witch understood that true wisdom required engagement with other perspectives and approaches to the fundamental questions of existence. She maintained diplomatic relations with the other lords who had emerged from the depths, recognizing that each possessed insights that could contribute to the collective understanding of the new age they were all working to create. Her relationship with Gwyn was particularly complex, for while they shared a fundamental commitment to bringing order and purpose to the world, their approaches to achieving these goals were often dramatically different. Where Gwyn sought to establish eternal principles that would guide existence according to unchanging laws, the witch embraced change and growth as natural expressions of life's creative force. These philosophical differences led to fascinating exchanges of ideas and methods, with scholars from both realms traveling between Anor Londo and Izalith to study alternative approaches to the great questions that occupied all thinking beings. The witch's pyromancers learned much from studying the lightning miracles that characterized Gwyn's divine magic, while his clerics found their understanding of the healing arts greatly enhanced by exposure to the life-affirming flame techniques developed in Izalith. Yet even as these cultural exchanges enriched both civilizations, they also highlighted fundamental tensions that would eventually prove impossible to resolve through diplomacy and mutual respect alone. The witch's emphasis on change and transformation inevitably came into conflict with Gwyn's desire for stability and order, creating philosophical disagreements that ran too deep to be easily bridged. As the Age of Fire progressed and matured, these underlying tensions began to manifest in more practical ways. The first flame that had given birth to all their power was not, despite its incredible magnitude, an inexhaustible source of energy. Like all flames, no matter how grand or significant, it required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel was slowly but steadily being consumed by the very existence of the age it had created. The witch, with her deep understanding of fire's nature, was among the first to recognize the implications of this gradual consumption. She could perceive in the flame's dancing patterns subtle changes that spoke of its slow decline, could sense in its radiance the first faint hints that its power was not as limitless as it had once seemed. The realization filled her with a mixture of scientific fascination and growing concern, for she understood better than most what would happen to their world if the first flame were ever to be extinguished. Her response to this crisis was characteristically innovative and ambitious. Rather than simply accepting the flame's eventual demise as an inevitable natural process, she began to explore the possibility of using her mastery of pyromancy to recreate the first flame itself, to kindle a new fire that could take its place and ensure the continuation of the age they had all worked so hard to build. The project that emerged from this vision was unprecedented in its scope and complexity, requiring not only her own considerable abilities, but also the combined efforts of her daughters and the most skilled pyromancers in all of Izalith. They would attempt to understand the fundamental principles that had given birth to the first flame, then apply that understanding to create a new fire that could serve the same cosmic function while drawing its power from sources that could be more easily renewed and maintained. The work began with careful study of the original flame, with expeditions to the deep caverns where it still burned to observe and record its properties with scientific precision. The witch and her daughters spent countless ages documenting every aspect of its behavior, from the colors that danced within its depths to the patterns of energy that flowed from its core to sustain the various forms of life and magic that depended upon its continued existence. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The first flame was indeed slowly consuming itself, burning through the disparity that had given it birth with a steady hunger that could not be satisfied by any external fuel. Its decline was not rapid by mortal standards, but for beings who had learned to think in terms of ages and eons, the signs of its eventual exhaustion were impossible to ignore. More disturbing still was their growing realization that the flame's decline was accelerating. Each year that passed saw it burning slightly less brightly than the year before. Each age that ended left it marginally weaker than the age that had preceded it. The process was still so gradual that its effects were barely perceptible, but the mathematical projections were unmistakable. Unless something was done to reverse or halt this decline, the first flame would eventually burn itself out entirely. The implications of such an event were catastrophic beyond imagination. Without the flame's power to sustain the age of disparity, the world would inevitably return to the grey uniformity of the ancient days when dragons ruled over eternal stasis. All the magnificent civilizations they had built, all the knowledge they had accumulated, all the art and beauty and wonder they had brought into existence would simply cease to be, returning to the undifferentiated void from which it had originally emerged. The witch's solution was audacious in its conception and tragic in its ultimate consequences. If the first flame could not be sustained indefinitely, then she would create a replacement flame using the same principles but drawing its power from renewable sources that could burn forever without consuming themselves. The magic she developed for this purpose represented the culmination of all her research into the nature of fire and life, a spell of such complexity and power that it required the willing participation of herself and all her daughters to bring to fruition. The ritual they designed was beautiful in its ambition and terrible in its scope. In the deepest chambers of Izalith, surrounded by the accumulated learning of ages and witnessed by flames that had been specially prepared for this moment of ultimate significance, the witch and her daughters joined their power together in an attempt to birth a new first flame that would serve all existence for ages without end. The magic they wove was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. A pyromantic working so complex that it seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They drew upon every technique they had mastered, every insight they had gained, every secret they had wrested from the dancing depths of flame itself. The air around them blazed with energies that had never before existed, while the stone beneath their feet grew warm with the heat of creation itself. For a moment that stretched across eternity, it seemed as though their impossible dream might actually be achieved. The magic they had unleashed began to coalesce into something that resembled the first flame in its radiance and power. A new fire that burned with all the promise of endless ages of continued existence. The witch felt triumph blazing in her heart as she witnessed the birth of what she believed would be her greatest achievement. But flames, no matter how carefully controlled or skillfully crafted, are ultimately wild things that cannot be fully tamed by even the most masterful pyromancer. The fire they had kindled was indeed powerful beyond anything they had imagined, But its power was not the controlled, purposeful energy of the first flame. Instead, it was something far more chaotic and destructive. A flame of pure creative force that burned without restraint or guidance, consuming everything it touched in an endless hunger for fuel and growth. This was the birth of the Chaos Flame, and with its emergence, everything that the witch had built and loved and worked to achieve was transformed beyond recognition. The controlled fires of her laboratory became raging infernos that devoured the carefully crafted instruments of her research. The gentle flames that had illuminated her city's streets became rivers of molten destruction that flowed through every corridor and chamber. The witch herself, caught in the heart of the magical working when it went catastrophically wrong, was transformed by forces too powerful and chaotic for even her considerable abilities to control. Her body was consumed by the Chaos Flame and reformed according to principles that bore no resemblance to anything she had intended, becoming something that was part tree, part flame, and part something altogether more alien and terrible. The Bed of Chaos, as she became known in the ages that followed, was both the witch and not the witch, a fusion of her original consciousness with the wild creative force she had accidentally unleashed. Her daughters, caught in the same transformation, became creatures of living flame whose forms reflected the chaotic energies that had reshaped their very existence. The city of Izalith itself was transformed from a center of learning and culture into something that defied easy description. The Chaos Flame spread through every chamber and corridor, not destroying the architecture but changing it into something organic and alive. Walls that breathed with the rhythm of flame, floors that pulsed with molten energy, ceilings that dripped with the tears of tortured stone. From this transformed realm there emerged creatures that had never before existed, the demons, beings born from the union of the Chaos Flame with whatever living things it encountered in its endless hunger for fuel and growth. These demons were not evil in any conventional sense, but rather expressions of pure creative chaos, creatures whose very existence defied the ordered principles that governed conventional life. Some demons took forms that suggested corrupted versions of familiar creatures, while others possessed shapes that seemed to have been drawn from nightmares or fever dreams, all burned with the same chaotic energy that had birthed them, their bodies serving as vessels for forces that could not be contained by ordinary flesh and bone. The tragedy of the witch's transformation resonated throughout the known world, serving as a stark reminder that even the most noble intentions could lead to catastrophic consequences when combined with forces beyond mortal understanding. Her attempt to save the age through the creation of a new first flame had instead unleashed something that threatened to consume everything she had sought to protect. Yet even in this moment of ultimate tragedy, there remained something of the witch's original nature within the chaos she had become. The Bed of Chaos, for all its alien horror, still pulsed with the same life-giving force that had originally drawn her to the first flame. The demons that emerged from her transformed realm, despite their terrifying appearance, possessed within themselves sparks of the same creative energy that had made Izalith a center of learning and innovation. The Chaos Flame continued to burn in the depths of the transformed city, no longer controlled but not entirely without purpose. It served as a testament to both the incredible power of creative ambition and the terrible dangers that awaited those who sought to reshape the fundamental forces of existence according to their own vision, no matter how noble their intentions might be. In the end, the Witch of Izalith's story became a cautionary tale about the price of hubris and the dangers of attempting to control forces beyond mortal understanding. Yet it was also a testament to the power of love and sacrifice, for her willingness to risk everything in an attempt to preserve the age she cherished demonstrated the depths of devotion that even divine beings could feel for the world they had helped to create. The chaos flame burns still in the depths of the ruined city, an eternal reminder of dreams that soared too high and fell too far, of good intentions that paved the road to unimaginable consequences, and of the thin line that separates creation from destruction in the cosmic dance of existence itself. In the deepest places beneath the ancient world, where neither the radiance of Gwyn's divine light nor the creative warmth of the witch's fires could penetrate, there dwelt one whose nature was as fundamental to existence as life itself, yet whose domain remained shrouded in mystery and shadow. This was the realm of endings, of conclusions, of the final rest that awaited all things that had known the burden of consciousness and the weight of mortal experience. From the first flame, when the hollow beings had gathered to claim their destinies from that impossible fire, there emerged a soul that pulsed not with light or creative force, but with something far more profound and necessary: the power to grant release from suffering, to provide completion to stories that had grown too heavy for their protagonists to carry, to serve as the gentle darkness that follows every bright day. This was the Lord's soul of death, claimed by the being who would become known as Gravelord Nito, the first of the dead. Unlike his fellow lords who sought to impose their will upon the world through creation and illumination, Nito understood from the moment of his transformation that his role would be fundamentally different, not to build or command, but to receive and to provide the final sanctuary that all beings would eventually require. The transformation that occurred when Nito's hollow form came into contact with the Death Soul was unlike any that had been witnessed before. Where Gwyn had blazed with sudden divinity and the witch had bloomed with creative fire, Nito's change was subtle and profound, a gradual settling into a form of existence that was both more and less than conventional life. His body became a vessel for mysteries that transcended normal understanding, a living embodiment of the principle that governs all endings. The death soul that now dwelt within him was not the absence of life, but rather its completion, the final chapter that gave meaning to all the chapters that had come before. It granted him understanding of the deep patterns that connected beginning to ending, birth to death, hope to fulfillment, in ways that created a comprehensive vision of existence as a complete cycle rather than a simple linear progression from start to finish. With this newfound wisdom came responsibilities that were perhaps more profound than those carried by any of the other lords. For while they could create or destroy according to their will, Nito had become the guardian of processes that operated according to laws more fundamental than personal desire or divine ambition. Death was not something that could be wielded like a weapon or channeled like magic. It was a natural force that required guidance and understanding rather than control. The domain that Nito chose to claim as his own reflected both his nature and his understanding of the role he was destined to play in the new age. Deep beneath the surface world, in caverns so vast that their boundaries disappeared into darkness that seemed to possess substance and weight of its own, he established the realm that would become known as the Tomb of the Giants. This was not a city in the conventional sense, like Anor Londo with its soaring spires and golden radiance, nor was it a center of learning and innovation like Izalith with its laboratories and workshops. Nito appeared as a towering figure composed primarily of bones that had been fused together by forces beyond mortal understanding, his skeleton serving as both armor and symbol of his dominion over the realm of the dead. Yet this was not the dry, brittle bone of ordinary mortality, but something far more substantial. Calcium and marrow transformed by divine power into material that possessed its own inner light and strength. Around his massive frame hung a cloak woven from the essence of death itself, a garment that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, while somehow managing to be beautiful rather than terrifying. The fabric moved with currents that had nothing to do with physical wind, responding instead to the ebb and flow of spiritual energies that governed the transition between life and whatever lay beyond. In his great hands, Nito bore weapons that were both tools of his office and symbols of the authority that had been granted to him by his Lord Soul. His sword was forged from metal that had been tempered in the fires of final rest, its blade capable of severing not just flesh and bone, but the very threads that bound soul to body when the time for separation had finally arrived. Yet, for all the awesome power that he commanded, Nito wielded his authority with a gentleness that spoke of profound wisdom and infinite compassion. He understood that death was not an enemy to be feared, but a friend to be welcomed when the time was right. The final gift that existence offered to those who had grown weary of the burden of consciousness and yearned for the peace that only ending could provide. The beings who served Nito in his deep domain were not subjects in the political sense, but rather fellow participants in the great work of providing sanctuary for those who sought release from the complications of continued existence. These were creatures that had been touched by death but not consumed by it, entities that existed in the liminal space between life and ending, serving as guides and guardians for souls making the transition from one state of being to another. Chief among these servants were the Skeleton Lords, beings that had once possessed individual identities and personalities, but had voluntarily surrendered their separateness to become extensions of Nito's will and purpose. They retained enough of their original consciousness to carry out complex tasks and make nuanced decisions, but their primary loyalty was to the principle of natural death rather than to any personal agenda or individual desire. These skeletal guardians moved through the tomb with purpose and dignity, their every action guided by profound respect for the sacred nature of their work. They tended to the arrangements of bones that decorated the chambers, ensuring that each skull and femur was placed according to principles that honored both the individual who had once inhabited that bone and the larger patterns that governed the realm of the dead. More mysterious were the giant skeletons that served as Nito's most trusted lieutenants in the governance of his dark domain. These colossal beings possessed intelligence and wisdom that rivaled that of the most learned scholars, yet they had chosen to dedicate their existence entirely to the service of death and the maintenance of the natural order that death represented. The giant skeletons communicated not through spoken language, but through harmonies that resonated through the bones themselves, creating music that could convey complex philosophical concepts and emotional nuances with a clarity and precision that mere words could never achieve. Their conversations filled the tomb with symphonies of meaning that spoke of death not as an ending but as a transformation, a graduation from one form of existence to another that was cause for celebration rather than mourning. Under Nito's guidance and protection, the Tomb of the Giants became a sanctuary for those who had grown weary of the complications and struggles that characterized life in the upper world. Here came souls who had lived full lives and were ready for the peace that only final rest could provide, as well as those who had been damaged by experiences too traumatic for healing and sought the release that death offered from memories too painful to bear. Yet Nito's domain was not simply a place where the dead came to rest, but also a center of learning where the deepest mysteries of existence could be studied and understood. The necromancers who sought to unlock the secrets of death's power came here to learn from the ultimate master of their art, studying under the direct guidance of one who had become death incarnate, while retaining the wisdom and compassion necessary to use such power responsibly. These necromantic studies were not the crude attempts to cheat death or resurrect the unwilling that would characterize later, more degenerate forms of the art. Instead, they focused on understanding death's role in the natural order, learning to work with the processes of ending and transformation, rather than against them, and developing the wisdom necessary to know when death should be embraced and when life should be preserved. The knowledge that emerged from these studies was profound and transformative, revealing death not as the opposite of life, but as its natural completion and fulfillment. The necromancers, who studied under Nito's guidance, learned to see endings not as failures or tragedies, but as necessary steps in cycles of existence that were far grander and more meaningful than any individual life or death. This understanding of death as a natural and necessary part of existence had profound implications for the other lords and the civilizations they were building. While Gwyn sought to establish eternal order, and the witch pursued endless creativity, Nito represented the principle that even the grandest achievements and most beautiful creations must eventually come to their natural conclusions if they were to retain their meaning and significance. His relationship with the other lords was complex and sometimes tense, for while they respected his wisdom and acknowledged the necessity of his role, they often found it difficult to accept his perspective on the temporary nature of all their achievements. Gwyn, in particular, struggled with the implications of Nito's philosophy, for the Lord of Sunlight had built his entire civilization on the assumption that the Age of Fire could be maintained indefinitely through proper application of will and power. The Witch of Izalith, with her deep understanding of creative processes, found Nito's perspective more compatible with her own worldview, recognizing that creation and destruction were intimately connected aspects of the same fundamental force. Her correspondence with the Lord of Death revealed philosophical depths that enriched both their understandings of the roles they had been called to play in the New Age. Yet, even as he maintained diplomatic relations with his fellow lords, Nito remained fundamentally apart from their political schemes and territorial ambitions. His domain existed outside the normal structures of power and authority that governed the surface world, serving instead as a neutral ground where the universal principles of ending and transformation could operate without interference from competing interests. The daily rhythm of existence in the Tomb of the Giants was governed not by the artificial divisions of time that characterized the upper world, but by the natural cycles of death and renewal that operated according to their own deeper logic. There were no clocks or calendars in Nito's domain, for time itself took on a different quality in a realm where endings were celebrated rather than feared. The rituals that structured life in the tomb were ceremonies of completion and gratitude, celebrations of lives well lived and stories well told, rather than mourning for what had been lost. When a soul finally arrived in Nito's domain, ready for the final rest it had earned through its struggles and achievements, it was welcomed with honors that acknowledged both its individual accomplishments and its contribution to the greater tapestry of existence. These ceremonies were conducted with a dignity and reverence that elevated them beyond mere funeral rites to something approaching high art. The arrangement of bones, the harmonies sung by the giant skeletons, the gentle guidance provided by the skeleton lords, all combined to create experiences that transformed death from an ending, to be feared, into a graduation to be celebrated. Yet Nito's wisdom extended far beyond the boundaries of his own domain, for he understood that death's role in the natural order had implications for all existence. The curse of undeath that would eventually plague the world was not, as many believed, a corruption of death's natural function, but rather a symptom of deeper imbalances in the cosmic order that the Lords had established. The Lord of Death recognized that the Age of Fire, for all its glory and achievement, was built upon a fundamental denial of natural cycles that would eventually create tensions too great for the system to contain. By seeking to establish permanent order and endless creativity while rejecting the role of ending and completion, the other lords were creating conditions that would inevitably lead to distortion and corruption. His attempts to communicate this understanding to his fellow lords met with varying degrees of success and resistance. Gwyn, committed as he was to the ideal of eternal order, found it almost impossible to accept that even the most perfect systems must eventually evolve or decay. The witch, more open to concepts of transformation and change, was nonetheless reluctant to acknowledge that her own creative projects might one day need to reach their natural conclusions. As the Age of Fire matured and the first signs of instability began to appear, Nito's warnings about the dangers of denying natural cycles proved increasingly prophetic. The undead curse that began to manifest among mortal populations was not a random affliction, but a direct consequence of the imbalances that had been built into the very foundations of their civilization. The curse represented death's attempt to restore natural order in a world that had been structured to prevent normal cycles of ending and renewal. Unable to function according to its proper role in the cosmic scheme, death manifested in distorted forms that created suffering rather than providing the peaceful release it was meant to offer. Nito's response to the emerging crisis was characteristically thoughtful and systematic. Rather than seeking to cure the curse through force or magic, he worked to understand its underlying causes and develop approaches that could restore balance to the disrupted natural order. His efforts focused not on fighting death, but on helping it function according to its proper role in the greater scheme of existence. The research he conducted into the nature of the undead curse revealed profound truths about the relationship between life, death, and the spiritual forces that govern both. He discovered that the curse was not actually preventing death, but rather preventing the peaceful completion that death was meant to provide, trapping souls in a liminal state where they could neither fully live nor properly die. This understanding led him to develop techniques and rituals that could help cursed individuals find the peace that the natural processes of death were supposed to provide. These methods did not cure the curse in the conventional sense, but rather helped those affected by it to achieve the spiritual completion that would allow them to move beyond the liminal state that trapped them. The wisdom that Nito accumulated through these studies would prove invaluable in the struggles that lay ahead, for he alone among the lords truly understood the cosmic forces that were driving the world toward crisis. His perspective on the temporary nature of all things, including the Age of Fire itself, provided insights that could guide the world through the transitions that were inevitably coming. Yet even as he prepared for the challenges ahead, Nito remained true to his fundamental nature as the guardian of peaceful endings and natural completion. He did not seek to prevent the changes that were coming, but rather to ensure that they could unfold according to natural principles, rather than being distorted by desperate attempts to maintain systems that had outlived their proper time. In the depths of the Tomb of the Giants, surrounded by the bones of those who had found their peace in his care, Gravelord Nito continued his eternal vigil over the processes of ending and renewal that gave meaning to all existence. His quiet wisdom and patient understanding represented a perspective that was essential for maintaining balance in a world increasingly dominated by the conflicting ambitions of creation and preservation. The first of the dead understood, as few others could, that even gods and ages must eventually come to their natural conclusions if the great story of existence was to continue unfolding according to its deeper purpose. His acceptance of this truth made him perhaps the wisest of all the lords, though it was a wisdom that few were prepared to embrace until the consequences of denying it became impossible to ignore. In the ancient world of grey stone and eternal twilight, where the everlasting dragons had ruled over unchanging perfection for countless eons, the emergence of the lords and their newfound power created ripples of transformation that would eventually grow into waves of revolutionary change. Yet the dragons, those magnificent beings who had known no beginning and feared no ending, remained unaware of the forces gathering in the depths below their domain, content in their timeless flights through colorless skies, and their eternal dominion over a world that had never known the possibility of alteration. The Age of Ancients had endured for so long that change itself seemed not merely unlikely but literally impossible, a concept so foreign to the nature of existence that even contemplating it required mental frameworks that had not yet been invented. The dragons moved through their realm with the serene confidence of beings who had never encountered anything that could threaten or challenge their supremacy, their ancient eyes seeing only the familiar patterns of stone and tree that had remained constant since the first moment of their awareness. Yet beneath the grey crags, in caverns so deep that they existed beyond the reach of draconic perception, the lords who had claimed their souls from the first flame were beginning to understand that their transformation had granted them not only incredible power, but also a cosmic responsibility that would ultimately bring them into conflict with the ancient order. The disparity that burned within their beings was fundamentally incompatible with the stasis that characterized the world above, creating tensions that could only be resolved through struggle and transformation. Gwyn, blazing with the radiance of his lord's soul of light, was the first to fully grasp the implications of their situation. His divine consciousness, illuminated by power that had never before existed in the world, revealed truths about the nature of existence that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The age he envisioned, with its golden cities and ordered civilizations, could never coexist with the unchanging dominion of the dragons, for light required darkness to give it meaning, and order could only emerge in contrast to the possibility of chaos. The Witch of Izalith, her understanding shaped by the creative fires that danced within her transformed being, recognized that the life force she commanded represented something entirely alien to the deathless perfection of the ancient world. Her flames yearned to kindle growth and change, to nurture new forms of existence that had never been imagined. But such creativity could not flourish in a realm where nothing was ever born because nothing was ever allowed to die. Even Nito, with his profound wisdom regarding endings and transformations, understood that the death he represented was not merely the opposite of life, but the necessary completion that gave life its meaning and urgency. In a world of immortal dragons where nothing ever changed, his role as the Lord of Death had no purpose and no function, for what meaning could endings have in a realm where beginnings were unknown? The conflict between the old order and the new was not merely political or territorial, but fundamental, arising from incompatible visions of what existence should be. The dragons represented perfection achieved through eternal stasis, while the lords embodied the principle of growth through struggle and change. These two philosophies could not coexist peacefully, for each denied the very foundation upon which the other was built. Yet the lords understood that they faced opponents whose power was beyond anything they could hope to match through conventional means. The dragons were not merely large or strong or magical, they were the living embodiment of immortality itself, beings so perfectly adapted to their unchanging world that they had transcended every weakness or vulnerability that might have made them susceptible to attack. Their scales could not be pierced by any weapon forged from earthly materials. Their bodies could not be harmed by fire or lightning, or any force that belonged to the realm of mortal existence. The challenge that faced the lords was not simply military but existential, requiring them to find ways to introduce concepts of vulnerability and mortality into beings that had never experienced either. They would need to discover methods of attack that could affect creatures existing outside the normal cycles of growth and decay, weapons that could wound immortal flesh, and strategies that could overcome enemies who had never known the possibility of defeat. The answer to this seemingly impossible challenge came from an unexpected source. For among the dragons themselves there existed one whose nature differed from all his kin in ways that would prove crucial to the coming conflict. Seath the Scaleless was unique among his kind, a dragon born without the mystical scales that granted his brethren their immunity to harm and their perfect integration with the unchanging world around them. Where other dragons possessed hides that gleamed with the same grey perfection as the ancient stone, Seath's flesh was pale and vulnerable, lacking the protective covering that made his kin invulnerable to conventional attack. This difference had marked him from birth as an outsider among his own people, a being whose very existence served as a reminder that even the most perfect systems could produce variations that challenged their fundamental assumptions. The absence of scales had profound implications beyond mere physical vulnerability, for those mystical protections were not simply armor, but the very mechanism through which dragons maintained their connection to the eternal nature of their realm. Without them, Seath experienced time and change in ways that were foreign to his kin, developing an understanding of mortality and transformation that made him intellectually capable of grasping concepts that other dragons could not even perceive. This unique perspective, combined with the bitter resentment that came from a lifetime of exclusion and mockery, made Seath susceptible to approaches from beings who represented everything his kind stood against. When the lords reached out to him with offers of alliance and promises of power, they found in him not an enemy to be converted, but a kindred spirit who had long yearned for the opportunity to strike back at those who had rejected him. The knowledge that Seath possessed regarding the nature of draconic immortality proved to be exactly what the lords needed to transform their impossible dream of victory into an achievable goal. He understood the mystical properties of dragon scales in ways that no outsider could have discovered through observation alone, revealing the precise mechanisms through which these protections functioned. More importantly, the specific conditions under which they could be stripped away. The intelligence he provided regarding the source of draconic power was revolutionary in its implications, for it revealed that the dragon's seeming invulnerability was not an inherent property of their beings, but rather a form of magical protection that could be disrupted through the application of forces that resonated at specific frequencias. The scales that covered their bodies were not merely physical armor, but mystical antennae that connected each dragon to the cosmic forces that sustained the Age of Ancients. By severing these connections, it would be possible to transform immortal dragons into mortal creatures vulnerable to conventional attack. The process would not be easy or simple, requiring weapons and techniques that had never before been conceived, but it was theoretically achievable through the careful application of the powers that the lords had gained from the first flame. Gwyn's lightning, properly focused and directed, could disrupt the mystical frequencies that connected scales to cosmic force. The witch's flames, carefully tuned to resonate with the energies that sustained draconic immunity, could burn away the protective covering that made dragons invulnerable. Even Nito's mastery of death could play a role, for his understanding of endings could be applied to the termination of the eternal cycles that sustained draconic immortality. Yet Seath's contribution went beyond mere technical knowledge, for his intimate understanding of dragon psychology and behavior provided the strategic insights necessary to plan a campaign that could succeed against opponents who had never before faced organized opposition. He knew their flight patterns, and their preferred territories, their methods of communication, and their responses to threats, their strengths and weaknesses, in ways that no external observer could have discovered. More importantly, he understood the fundamental arrogance that came from eons of unchallenged supremacy, the assumption of invulnerability that would make the dragons slow to recognize the true nature of the threat they faced. This overconfidence could be exploited through carefully planned attacks that would catch the ancient lords of the sky unprepared for resistance that could actually harm them. The alliance between the Lords and the Scaleless One was formalized in secret councils held in the deepest chambers beneath the ancient world, where the light of the first flame provided illumination for planning sessions that would reshape the destiny of all existence. These meetings brought together beings whose natures were fundamentally different, yet whose goals had become aligned through the pressure of necessity and the promise of mutual benefit. The strategies that emerged from these councils were as revolutionary as they were ambitious, calling for coordinated attacks that would exploit every weakness in the draconic position, while maximizing the advantages that the Lords possessed through their divine power and their alliance with one who knew the enemy from within. The campaign they planned would not be a single battle, but a systematic war designed to strip away the foundations of draconic power layer by layer. The first phase of their strategy involved the creation of weapons specifically designed to overcome draconic immunity, artifacts forged from materials that had been transformed by direct contact with the Lord's divine power. These were not conventional arms, but mystical constructs that embodied the principles of change and mortality, objects whose very existence was an affront to the eternal stasis that characterized the ancient world. Gwyn's contribution to this arsenal was the most dramatic and visible, for from his own essence he forged the lightning spears that would become the signature weapons of the war against the dragons. These were not mere projectiles, but concentrated manifestations of divine power, bolts of pure disparity that could disrupt the mystical connections between dragon and cosmos with devastating effectiveness. Each lightning spear was a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship, its crystalline structure designed to channel and focus the Lord of Sunlight's radiance into forms that could penetrate even the most perfect draconic defenses. When hurled by hands that possessed the strength of gods, these weapons could cross vast distances in the span of a heartbeat, striking their targets with force that combined physical impact with spiritual disruption. The witch's weapons were more subtle but no less deadly, flames that had been crafted to burn at frequencies specifically tuned to the mystical properties of dragon scales. These fires could not be extinguished by conventional means, for they fed not on ordinary fuel but on the magical energies they were designed to consume, growing stronger as they devoured the very protections they were created to destroy. Nito's contribution to the war effort was perhaps the most profound, for he brought to bear against the dragons the one force they had never learned to resist the power of ending itself. His weapons were imbued with the capacity to sever the connections that bound immortal beings to their eternal existence, introducing concepts of mortality and vulnerability into minds that had never conceived such possibilities. Yet weapons alone, no matter how perfectly crafted or divinely empowered, could not guarantee victory against opponents whose mastery of their environment had been honed across eons of unchallenged dominion. The Lords understood that success would require not only superior armaments, but also tactical brilliance and strategic coordination that could overcome the natural advantages their enemies possessed. The dragons controlled the skies, possessed intimate knowledge of every peak and valley in their domain, and could call upon the support of creatures that had served them faithfully since the beginning of time. The archtrees themselves were allied with the ancient order, their massive branches providing platforms and fortifications that could shelter entire armies, while their root systems created underground networks that dragons could use for concealed movement. To overcome these advantages, the Lords developed innovative approaches to warfare that had never before been attempted or even imagined. They learned to fight in 3 dimensions, developing tactics that could function equally effectively on the ground, in underground caverns, and in the aerial realm where dragons possessed their greatest advantages. The alliance they forged with various creatures that had been touched by the power of the first flame created a coalition that could match the dragon's natural supporters through sheer diversity and adaptability. Where the ancient order relied on unchanging patterns and predictable responses, the Lord's forces embraced innovation and improvisation, developing new techniques and strategies as the conflict progressed. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a conflict that raged across dimensions and through realms of existence that had never before been touched by violence or struggle. The very concept of warfare had to be invented as the conflict progressed, for neither side possessed prior experience with organized combat or military strategy. The opening phases of the war were marked by tentative probes and experimental attacks as both sides sought to understand the capabilities and limitations of their opponents. The dragons, initially dismissive of what they perceived as minor irritations from insignificant surface dwellers, gradually came to realize that they faced threats unlike any they had encountered in their eternal existence. The first successful use of lightning spears against a dragon sent shockwaves through the ancient hierarchy, for the sight of mystical scales being torn away by divine power challenged everything the dragons believed about their own invulnerability. The wounded dragon, stripped of its immortal protections and suddenly vulnerable to conventional attack, became a symbol of the fundamental change that was sweeping through their unchanging world. The psychological impact of this first success was perhaps as significant as the tactical advantage it provided, for it demonstrated to both sides that the outcome of the conflict was not predetermined by ancient precedent or traditional power structures. The Lords had proven that change was possible even in a realm that had been built upon the principle of eternal stasis. Yet the dragons were not passive victims of the Lord's aggression, for despite their inexperience with warfare, they possessed capabilities that made them formidable opponents even when stripped of their mystical immunity. Their size and strength remained impressive by any standard, while their mastery of their environment gave them advantages that could not be easily overcome through superior weapons or tactical innovation alone. The battles that followed the initial breakthrough were epic in scope and devastating in their consequences, conflicts that scarred the landscape and left permanent marks upon the very structure of reality itself. Mountains were leveled by the impact of falling dragons, while valleys were carved by the passage of lightning spears that missed their targets and continued traveling until they buried themselves in the grey stone of the ancient world. The arch trees, those mighty pillars that had supported the structure of existence since the beginning of time, became battlegrounds where forces beyond mortal comprehension struggled for supremacy over the fundamental nature of reality. Some of these ancient giants were destroyed completely, their massive trunks toppling with crashes that shook the foundations of the world and left gaps in the cosmic order that would never be completely filled. As the war progressed and the initial advantage of surprise was exhausted, the conflict settled into a grinding struggle of attrition that tested the resolve and resources of both sides. The Lord's superior weapons and innovative tactics were balanced against the dragons' intimate knowledge of their territory and their ability to call upon allies that had served the ancient order since its inception. The tide of battle shifted back and forth as each side developed new strategies and countermeasures, creating a dynamic conflict that evolved continuously as both sides learned from their successes and failures. The dragons began to develop techniques for avoiding or deflecting lightning spears, while the lords refined their weapons and tactics to overcome these defensive innovations. The war's middle phases were characterized by increasingly sophisticated and coordinated attacks, as both sides committed their full resources to achieving final victory. The Lord's campaign became a systematic effort to locate and destroy every major dragon stronghold, while the ancient rulers of the sky organized massive aerial offensives designed to overwhelm their opponents through sheer force of numbers. The battles of this period were marked by innovations that would have been inconceivable during the war's opening phases. The lords learned to fight effectively in aerial combat, developing techniques that allowed earthbound warriors to engage flying opponents on equal terms. The dragons, in turn, discovered methods of coordinated ground attack that could exploit the limitations of opponents who lacked their natural mastery of three-dimensional movement. Yet gradually, inevitably, the accumulated advantages possessed by the lords began to tip the balance of the conflict in their favor. Their superior adaptability and innovation, combined with the insider knowledge provided by Seath, allowed them to develop solutions to every defensive measure the dragons could devise. The psychological factor of Seath's betrayal proved to be as devastating as the tactical advantages it provided, for the knowledge that one of their own had turned against them undermined the dragons' confidence in their cause and their assumptions about their natural superiority. The sight of a scaleless dragon fighting alongside their enemies challenged every belief about racial loyalty and natural order that had governed draconic society since its inception. The final phases of the war were marked by increasingly desperate attempts by the remaining dragons to preserve something of their ancient civilization and dominion. Some retreated to the most remote corners of their realm, hoping to wait out the conflict in hidden strongholds where the Lord's power could not reach them. Others attempted to negotiate terms that would allow them to retain some portion of their former authority in exchange for acknowledging the new order. Yet the fundamental incompatibility between the Age of Stasis and the Age of Disparity made peaceful coexistence impossible to achieve. The Lords understood that any dragon stronghold that survived the war would serve as a focal point for attempts to restore the ancient order, while any negotiated settlement would be seen by their own followers as a betrayal of the principles for which they had fought and died. The war could only end with the complete victory of one side or the other, for there was no middle ground between eternal stasis and dynamic change. No compromise position that could satisfy both the desire for unchanging perfection and the need for growth through struggle and transformation. The climactic battles of the war were fought not over territory or resources, but over the very right to define the fundamental nature of existence itself. The Lords fought to establish their vision of a world where change was possible and growth was valued, while the dragons made their final stand in defense of principles that had governed reality since the beginning of time. When the last great dragon fell, its scales torn away by lightning spears, and its immortal flesh consumed by flames tuned to the frequency of endings, the Age of Ancients died with it. The world that had existed in perfect stasis for countless eons was transformed in a moment into something new and unprecedented, a realm where change was not only possible, but inevitable. The victory of the Lords marked the beginning of the Age of Fire, an era defined not by the eternal perfection of unchanging stone, but by the dynamic interplay of forces that could create and destroy in equal measure. Yet this triumph came at a cost that none of the victors had fully anticipated, for the world they had won was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before, a realm where even gods would discover that nothing, not even divine power, could last forever. The ashes of the ancient world would serve as the foundation for new civilizations and new forms of existence, but they would also carry within themselves the memory of what had been lost, and the knowledge that even the most glorious ages must eventually come to their own endings. The wheel of fate had begun to turn, and none who rode upon it, not even lords with the power to reshape reality itself, could predict where its revolutions might lead. In the aftermath of the Great War against the dragons, when the last of the ancient lords had fallen from skies that would never again know their eternal presence, the world found itself transformed beyond recognition into something that had never before existed in all the long ages of creation. The grey stone that had once been the foundation of unchanging perfection now gleamed with new possibilities, while the colourless sky blazed with hues that had been born from the disparity unleashed by the first flame's revolutionary power. This was the dawn of the Age of Fire in its full glory, a time when the principles of growth and change that the lords had fought to establish could finally express themselves without the crushing weight of ancient stasis holding them back. The victory over the dragons had not merely changed the political structure of the world, but had fundamentally altered the very nature of existence itself, creating conditions where innovation and development could flourish as never before. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, stood triumphant amid the transformed landscape, his radiance no longer competing with the grey uniformity of the ancient world, but free to illuminate realities that sparkled with unprecedented beauty and complexity. The golden light that streamed from his divine form touched everything it encountered, transforming mere stone into gleaming marble, turning simple water into crystal streams that sang with their own inner music, and filling the air itself with a luminous quality that made every breath a celebration of the new age's possibilities. From his throne in Anor Londo, which had grown even more magnificent in the aftermath of victory, Gwyn began the great work of establishing the new world order that would govern the Age of Fire. This was not merely a matter of political administration, but a cosmic undertaking that required him to define the fundamental principles according to which all existence would henceforth operate. Where the ancient world had been governed by the simple law of eternal stasis, the new age required complex systems of organization that could accommodate growth, change, and the endless creativity that disparity had made possible. The city of the gods had expanded beyond its original boundaries to become a realm that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some higher dimension of pure possibility. New towers and spires rose from foundations of crystallized light, their architecture expressing mathematical principles that spoke of divine harmony, while their very existence served as proof that the age of limitations had given way to an era of unlimited potential. In the great cathedral at the heart of Anor Londo, Gwyn established not merely a throne room, but a center of cosmic administration, where the forces that governed all reality could be monitored and directed according to the needs of the new age. The crystal throne from which he ruled had grown to accommodate his expanded consciousness, its faceted surfaces now reflecting not just his personal radiance, but the collective light of all the souls that had been touched by the power of disparity. The establishment of divine law required Gwyn to codify principles that had never before needed explicit statement, for the ancient world had operated according to natural laws so fundamental that they had never required conscious guidance or deliberate administration. Now, in an age where change was not only possible but inevitable, there was need for structures that could provide stability without stifling growth, order without preventing innovation. The legal code that emerged from these deliberations was revolutionary in its scope and ambition, establishing frameworks that could govern everything from the relationships between different forms of life to the proper methods for conducting research into the fundamental forces of existence. These laws were not arbitrary restrictions imposed from above, but careful attempts to create conditions where all beings could flourish according to their nature while contributing to the greater harmony of the whole. Yet Gwyn understood that law alone, no matter how perfectly crafted, could not sustain the new order without institutions capable of implementing and maintaining the principles he had established. The creation of these organizations required him to delegate portions of his divine authority to beings who could serve as extensions of his will, while possessing the wisdom and integrity necessary to use such power responsibly. The knighthood that had served him so faithfully during the war against the dragons was expanded and formalized into a comprehensive system of governance that could reach every corner of the transformed world. Ornstein, whose prowess with lightning had made him legendary even among the gods themselves, was elevated to serve as the chief administrator of divine justice, his golden armor now serving as both symbol and instrument of the Lord of Sunlight's authority. Under Ornstein's guidance, the Knights of Anor Londo became more than mere warriors or enforcers of divine will. They were transformed into a comprehensive administrative system that could handle everything from the resolution of disputes between different communities to the coordination of large-scale construction projects that required divine oversight and supernatural resources. The establishment of the Way of White as the primary religious organization of the New Age represented perhaps Gwyn's most ambitious attempt to extend his influence beyond the immediate boundaries of his divine realm. This was not merely a church in the conventional sense, but a comprehensive educational and social welfare system designed to carry the principles of the Age of Fire to every community that had emerged in the transformed world. The clerics of the Way of White were trained not only in religious doctrine and ceremonial practice, but in all the practical arts necessary for building and maintaining civilized communities. They carried with them knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry, medicine and engineering, law and governance, music and literature, everything needed to transform scattered groups of survivors from the ancient world into thriving centers of culture and learning. The miracles they performed were not mere displays of supernatural power, but practical demonstrations of the benefits that came from aligning oneself with the divine principles that governed the New Age. Their healing magic could mend not only physical injuries, but also the spiritual wounds that had been inflicted by the trauma of witnessing their entire world transformed beyond recognition. More importantly, they served as living proof that mortal beings could aspire to greatness through dedication to principles larger than themselves, that the power of the gods was not reserved for divine beings alone, but could be shared with anyone willing to commit themselves to the service of light and order. The expansion of this religious and educational network created the infrastructure necessary for the rapid development of civilization throughout the known world. Communities that had struggled merely to survive in the aftermath of the Great War found themselves growing into prosperous towns and cities, their development guided by principles that had been tested and refined in the divine laboratories of Anor Londo itself. Yet, even as Gwyn worked to establish the administrative and religious structures that would govern the New Age, his fellow lords were pursuing their own visions of what the transformed world might become. The Witch of Izalith, her creative powers now free to express themselves without the constraints imposed by ancient stasis, had transformed her underground domain into a center of learning and innovation that rivaled even Anor Londo in its achievements. The pyromantic arts that had developed in Izalith during the early days of the Age of Fire had evolved into a comprehensive system of magical and technological advancement that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible even in an era defined by unprecedented change. The witches' laboratories produced wonders that seemed to blur the line between science and sorcery, creating tools and techniques that could accomplish feats which would have been literally inconceivable during the grey uniformity of the ancient world. The relationship between Anor Londo and Izalith during this golden period was characterized by productive cooperation rather than competitive rivalry, with scholars and researchers from both domains engaging in exchanges of knowledge and technique that enriched both civilizations. Gwyn's expertise in the manipulation of light and divine power complemented the witch's mastery of fire and creative transformation, while her understanding of growth and change provided insights that helped him refine his own approaches to governance and social organization. The diplomatic relations between the two domains extended beyond mere intellectual collaboration to include joint projects that required the combined resources and expertise of both divine realms. The creation of new forms of life adapted to the conditions of the transformed world. The establishment of trade routes that could safely traverse territories still scarred by the aftermath of the war against the dragons. The development of communication systems that could coordinate activities across vast distances. All of these undertakings required cooperation between different approaches to divine power. Nito, Lord of Death, maintained his domain in the depths below the transformed world, but his role in the New Age had evolved significantly from his function during the war, where he had once served primarily as a source of weapons and strategies for use against immortal enemies. He now provided the essential service of managing the natural cycles of ending and renewal that gave meaning to the creative activities of his fellow lords. The Tomb of the Giants had expanded to accommodate the new realities of an age where death and birth occurred in regular cycles rather than being unknown concepts. The peaceful chambers where souls could find rest after lives well lived had been supplemented by new facilities designed to help beings navigate the complex transitions between different states of existence that had become possible in the wake of the First Flame's influence. The relationship between life and death in the Age of Fire was far more complex than it had been in the ancient world, where immortality had been a simple fact of existence, rather than a goal to be achieved or a condition to be maintained. Now, beings could choose their relationship to mortality according to their nature and desires, with some embracing the intensity that came from limited lifespans, while others sought to extend their existence through various forms of divine intervention. Nito's wisdom regarding the proper balance between creation and destruction, growth and decay, beginning and ending, made him an invaluable advisor to his fellow lords, as they worked to establish systems that could maintain stability without stifling the very changes that defined their age. His deep understanding of natural cycles provided insights that helped prevent the kind of imbalances that could lead to stagnation or chaos. The Fourth Lord, the furtive pygmy who had claimed the dark soul from the First Flame, remained largely separate from the grand civilizational projects undertaken by his more visible companions. Yet his influence on the developing age was perhaps more profound than any of the others, for from his essence had emerged the race of humans, beings whose nature embodied the very principle of disparity that had made the Age of Fire possible. Humanity, as it came to be known, represented something entirely new in the history of existence, a form of life that was neither divine nor merely mortal, but something that existed in the space between these categories. Humans possessed souls that burned with fragments of the Dark Soul's power, granting them capabilities that seemed modest compared to the cosmic forces wielded by the Lords, but which proved remarkably adaptable to the changing conditions of the new world. Where the gods had been shaped by specific aspects of the First Flame's power, humans possessed a more general connection to the principle of disparity itself, making them uniquely suited to serve as bridges between different forms of existence. They could learn to use the miracles associated with Gwyn's divine light, study the pyromancies developed in the witches' laboratories, and even master aspects of the necromantic arts that originated in Nito's domain. More importantly, humans demonstrated a capacity for growth and change that exceeded even that of divine beings. For while the lords were constrained by the specific nature of their lord souls, humanity's connection to the dark soul granted them the flexibility to adapt to new circumstances and develop new capabilities according to their needs and desires. The communities that humans established throughout the transformed world became centers of innovation and cultural development that complemented and sometimes exceeded the achievements of the divine realms. Their cities grew organically from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it, their architecture reflecting a deep understanding of the relationship between form and function that had been learned through trial and error, rather than inherited through divine inspiration. The arts that flourished in these human settlements reflected the complex nature of beings who existed between mortality and divinity, neither fully bound by natural law nor completely freed from its constraints. Their music captured emotions and experiences that were unique to creatures who knew both the intensity of limited lifespans and the possibility of transcending those limitations through dedication and achievement. Their literature explored themes that had never before existed, stories that dealt with the challenges and opportunities that came from living in a world where change was constant and growth was always possible. Their philosophy attempted to understand the meaning of existence in an age where the fundamental questions about the nature of reality had been answered in ways that created new and even more profound mysteries. The relationship between human civilization and the divine realms was generally characterized by mutual benefit and respect, though it was not without its tensions and complications. Humans looked to the gods for guidance and protection, while the lords found in humanity a source of inspiration and renewal that helped prevent their own divine natures from becoming stagnant or overly rigid. The various races that had emerged from the transformed world during the early days of the Age of Fire had also established their own domains and cultures, each contributing unique perspectives and capabilities to the growing complexity of the new civilization. The development of these different societies created a rich tapestry of cultural exchange and mutual influence that enriched all participants while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that made each group valuable in its own right. Trade networks began to emerge as different communities discovered that they could benefit from exchanging resources and knowledge with distant neighbors who had developed different solutions to common problems. These commercial relationships created bonds that went beyond mere economic advantage, fostering cultural exchanges that led to innovations and discoveries that no single community could have achieved in isolation. The establishment of common languages and communication protocols allowed for the coordination of large-scale projects that required the cooperation of multiple communities across vast distances. The construction of roads and bridges, the development of systems for managing water resources, the creation of warning networks that could alert distant communities to various forms of danger. All of these undertakings demonstrated the potential for cooperative achievement that had been unlocked by the principles of the Age of Fire. Yet even in this golden age of expansion and achievement, there were those among the lords who possessed the wisdom to recognize that the current period of growth and prosperity could not continue indefinitely. The first flame that had made all of their achievements possible was not, despite its incredible power and seemingly inexhaustible energy, truly eternal in nature. Like all flames, no matter how grand or significant, the first flame required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel was slowly but steadily being consumed by the very existence of the age it had created. The disparity that it had brought into existence, the souls that drew their power from its radiance, the magic and miracles, and all the countless wonders of the Age of Fire. All of these things drew their sustenance from the flame's core, gradually diminishing the store of energy that kept it burning. The signs of this gradual consumption were subtle and easily overlooked by those who were caught up in the excitement of building new civilizations and exploring new possibilities. The flame still burned as brightly as ever to casual observation. Its radiance continued to illuminate and inspire all who approached it, and its power remained more than adequate to sustain the various forms of magic and miracle that depended upon its continued existence. Yet, those with the deepest understanding of fire's nature, particularly the Witch of Izalith, with her intimate knowledge of flame's behavior and requirements, began to detect almost imperceptible changes in the patterns of the first flame's dance. The colors that swirled within its depths showed subtle variations from the hues that had characterized its earlier burning, while the rhythms of its pulsing carried hints of some fundamental alteration in its essential nature. These observations were initially dismissed as natural variations in a force too complex for complete understanding, but as time passed and the changes became more pronounced, it became impossible to ignore the implications of what they were witnessing. The first flame was not merely changing but actually diminishing, slowly consuming itself in the process of sustaining the age it had brought into existence. The discovery of this gradual decline created the first serious philosophical crisis of the Age of Fire, forcing the Lords to confront questions that had never before needed to be addressed. If the flame that had made their age possible was not eternal, what would happen when it finally exhausted itself? Could the magnificent civilizations they had built survive the loss of the power source that had enabled their creation? Was there any way to prevent or reverse the process of decline that threatened to undo everything they had accomplished? Different lords approached these questions according to their natures and the specific insights granted by their lord souls. Gwyn, with his commitment to order and stability, began to explore methods that might allow the flame to be sustained indefinitely through careful management and conservation of its remaining power. If the flame's decline could be slowed or halted, then the Age of Fire might be extended indefinitely, preserving forever the golden age of achievement they had worked so hard to establish. The Witch of Izalith, driven by her understanding of creative processes and her deep love for the fire that had enabled her greatest achievements, began to investigate the possibility of kindling a new flame that could take the place of the original when it finally burned out. Her research into the fundamental principles that governed the first flame's operation suggested that it might be possible to recreate its power through the application of sufficient knowledge and effort. Nito, with his profound understanding of natural cycles and the necessity of endings, advocated for acceptance of the flame's eventual decline as a natural part of the cosmic order. In his view, the Age of Fire, like all ages before it, was meant to run its course and give way to whatever form of existence might follow, and attempts to prevent this transition could lead to distortions and imbalances that would ultimately cause more suffering than they prevented. The debate among the lords regarding the proper response to the flame's decline would continue for ages, shaping not only their individual actions but also the policies and priorities of their respective domains. The golden age of the Age of Fire would continue for many years to come, but the knowledge of its impermanence had introduced an element of uncertainty and urgency that would eventually transform the very character of the civilizations they had built. For now, though, the flame continued to burn brightly enough to sustain all the wonders of the age, and the various peoples of the transformed world continued their work of building, creating, learning, and growing according to the principles of disparity and change that had been purchased through victory over the ancient order of eternal stasis. As the ages of fire matured and flourished, as the golden spires of Anor Londo reached ever higher toward heavens that blazed with divine radiance, and as the great civilizations built by gods and mortals alike achieved heights of beauty and wisdom that seemed destined to endure for all eternity, there began to manifest subtle changes that only the most perceptive observers could detect in the fundamental forces that sustained their magnificent world. The first flame, that cosmic fire from which all disparity and possibility had emerged in those distant days when hollow beings first approached its impossible radiance, continued to burn in the depths beneath the transformed earth. Yet its dance had begun to show variations so minute that they might have been dismissed as natural fluctuations, in a force too vast and complex for complete mortal understanding, were it not for the growing consistency with which these changes appeared. The colors that swirled within the flame's dancing heart, once brilliant beyond description in their intensity and purity, had begun to show the faintest suggestion of dimming, as if some infinitesimal portion of their radiance was being held back or absorbed by forces that had not previously affected the flame's perfect expression. The rhythms that governed its pulsing, once as regular and eternal as the beating of some cosmic heart, now carried within them subtle irregularities that suggested processes of change occurring deep within the fire's essential nature. These alterations were so gradual and so slight that even the lords themselves, despite their intimate connection to the flame's power through their lord souls, initially failed to recognize the true significance of what they were witnessing. The flame still provided more than adequate energy to sustain all the miracles and wonders of their age, still blazed with sufficient intensity to illuminate the darkest corners of existence, still pulsed with enough creative force to kindle new forms of life and possibility wherever its influence was felt. Yet the Witch of Izalith, whose deep understanding of fire's nature surpassed that of any other being in existence, began to perceive patterns within these changes that filled her with growing unease. Her countless ages of studying flame in all its forms had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that preceded more dramatic alterations in a fire's behavior, and what she saw in the first flame's evolving dance spoke of processes that could not be ignored indefinitely. The flame was consuming itself, burning through the fundamental disparity that had given it birth and sustained its existence across all the long ages since the hollow beings had first approached it in those deep caverns. Like any fire, no matter how magnificent or apparently inexhaustible, it required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel was finite in ways that had not been apparent during the intoxicating early days when every possibility seemed unlimited and every dream appeared achievable. The disparity itself, that precious quality of difference and change that had made the Age of Fire possible, was slowly being transformed and absorbed by the very flame that had created it. Each soul that drew power from the fire's radiance, each miracle that channeled its energy into wondrous effects, each manifestation of magic or divinity that depended upon its continued burning, all of these things consumed tiny portions of the essential difference that kept the flame alive. The mathematics of this consumption were inexorable in their implications, though the process operated on such vast timescales that its effects remained nearly invisible to beings accustomed to thinking in terms of mortal lifespans, or even the extended existence of divine consciousness. Yet when projected across the eons that would be required for the flame's complete exhaustion, the pattern became unmistakable. The first flame would eventually burn itself out entirely, consuming all available fuel until nothing remained but the grey uniformity from which it had originally emerged. The recognition of this approaching crisis forced the lords to confront questions that struck at the very heart of everything they had built and achieved during the golden age of their civilization. If the flame that made their existence possible was destined to fade, what would become of the magnificent cities they had raised, the knowledge they had accumulated, the forms of life and consciousness that had never before existed in all the long history of creation? The implications of the flame's eventual extinction were catastrophic beyond imagination, for without its power to sustain the principle of disparity, the world would inevitably return to the grey stasis that had characterized the Age of Ancients. The dynamic forces of growth and change that had enabled such incredible achievements would cease to function, while all the complex forms of existence that depended upon the flame's energy would simply dissolve back into the undifferentiated void from which they had originally been shaped. Worse still was the realization that the flame's decline appeared to be accelerating as the Age of Fire progressed and matured. The more souls that drew upon its power, the more miracles that channeled its energy, the more complex and sophisticated the civilizations that depended upon its continued burning became, the faster the rate at which it consumed, the disparity that sustained its existence. This acceleration created a cruel paradox that struck at the heart of everything the Lords had sought to accomplish. The very success of their age, the magnificent achievements and wondrous innovations that they had fostered and celebrated, was hastening the arrival of the crisis that would ultimately destroy everything they had worked to create. Each new discovery that expanded the applications of divine power, each advancement that made life more beautiful or meaningful, each soul that awakened to the possibilities offered by the Age of Fire, all of these victories carried within themselves the seeds of ultimate defeat. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, was among the first to fully grasp the implications of this approaching catastrophe, his divine consciousness illuminated by the same radiant power that allowed him to perceive the subtle changes occurring within the first flame itself. The prospect of watching his golden age fade into grey uniformity, of seeing the magnificent civilization he had built crumble into the eternal stasis of the ancient world, filled him with a determination that burned even brighter than his usual divine radiance. His response to the crisis was characteristically ambitious and decisive, reflecting the same commanding will that had enabled him to forge victory against the dragons and establish the foundations of divine civilization. If the first flame required fuel to continue burning, then he would provide that fuel through whatever means necessary, regardless of the personal cost or the sacrifices that might be demanded of him and those who served his cause. The solution he envisioned was as audacious as it was desperate. He would offer himself as fuel for the failing flame, feeding his own Lord's soul into its diminishing fire, to provide the energy needed to sustain the Age of Fire for additional eons. His divine essence, accumulated across ages of rule and refined through countless acts of cosmic responsibility, contained enough power to serve as fuel for the flame's continued burning, at least for a time. Yet Gwyn understood that even this ultimate sacrifice would provide only a temporary reprieve from the inevitable crisis, postponing rather than preventing the flame's eventual extinction. His Lord's soul, no matter how powerful, was still finite in nature, and its consumption would merely grant the world additional ages of existence, rather than solving the fundamental problem of the flame's dependency upon limited resources. The knowledge that his sacrifice would be temporary rather than permanent added poignancy to his decision, for he was choosing to give up his divine existence for a reprieve whose duration could not be predicted with certainty. He might purchase decades or centuries, or even millennia of continued existence for his age, but eventually even his magnificent essence would be consumed, leaving the world to face the same crisis he was attempting to forestall. The process by which a Lord's soul could be linked to the first flame as fuel for its continued burning was not something that could be accomplished through simple will or conventional magical techniques. It required a ritual of such complexity and power that it existed at the very boundaries of what was considered possible, even in an age defined by wonders and miracles that defied normal understanding. The preparations for this unprecedented undertaking consumed the attention and resources of the finest minds in all of Anor Londo, divine intelligences that had never before been confronted with challenges of such cosmic scope and significance. The ritual they designed would transform the very nature of the first flame itself, changing it from a naturally occurring force into something that could be sustained through deliberate sacrifice and conscious intervention. The knowledge required for such a transformation drew upon every branch of learning that had been developed during the Age of Fire, combining insights from divine theology with practical understanding of magical processes, theoretical philosophy with engineering precision, artistic inspiration with mathematical rigor. The scholars and artificers who worked on the project were attempting to codify and implement procedures that had never before been attempted by any conscious intelligence. The location chosen for the ritual was the kiln of the first flame itself, that sacred chamber deep beneath the world where the original fire continued to burn in its ancient brazier. This was hallowed ground that had been touched by divinity since the very beginning of the Age of Fire, consecrated by proximity to the source of all disparity and possibility, sanctified by ages of providing the foundational energy that sustained all existence. The approach to the kiln required passage through territories that had been scarred by the flame's gradual decline, regions where the weakening of disparity had allowed portions of the ancient grey uniformity to begin reasserting themselves. These transitional areas served as stark reminders of what awaited the entire world if the flame were allowed to burn out completely, landscapes where colour slowly faded back toward the monochrome perfection of eternal stasis. The guardians that protected the path to the kiln were not conventional sentries, but manifestations of the flame's own defensive mechanisms, beings of living fire and crystallized light that existed to prevent unauthorized access to the cosmic forces housed within. These entities challenged anyone who sought to approach the first flame, testing their worthiness through trials that demanded not only strength and skill, but also purity of purpose and absolute dedication to the preservation of the age. When Gwyn finally stood before the first flame in all its diminished but still magnificent glory, he understood with perfect clarity what his sacrifice would accomplish and what it would cost. The linking of his Lord's soul to the flame's essence would indeed provide the energy needed to sustain the Age of Fire for additional ages, but it would also fundamentally alter his own existence in ways that could never be reversed or undone. The ritual itself was both beautiful and terrible to witness. A cosmic transformation that operated on scales too vast for mortal comprehension, yet intimate enough to touch the very essence of individual consciousness. Gwyn's divine form began to merge with the flame itself, his golden radiance becoming indistinguishable from the fire's own light, as his Lord's soul was gradually absorbed into the cosmic forces that sustained all disparity. The process was not simply destructive but transformative, changing both the Lord of Sunlight and the first flame in ways that created something entirely new, a hybrid entity that possessed characteristics of both divine consciousness and cosmic force, capable of deliberate action yet bound to the eternal task of maintaining the conditions necessary for the Age of Fire's continued existence. Yet even as Gwyn's sacrifice restored the flame to something approaching its original vitality, even as the renewed radiance began to flow outward from the kiln to revitalize the magic and miracles that depended upon its power, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The flame still required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel would eventually be exhausted, regardless of how carefully it was managed or how efficiently it was used. The linking of the fire had established a precedent and created a mechanism through which the crisis could be repeatedly postponed, but it had not eliminated the underlying issue that threatened the long-term survival of the age. Future heroes would need to repeat Gwyn's sacrifice when his essence was finally consumed, offering their own souls as fuel for the flame's continued burning in an endless cycle of noble self-destruction. The curse of undeath that began to manifest throughout the mortal populations of the world was not, as many believed, a random affliction or a punishment for some forgotten transgression. Instead, it was a direct consequence of the imbalances created by Gwyn's linking of the fire, a symptom of the artificial nature of the flame's continued existence and the distortions this created in the natural order of life and death. The linking had preserved the Age of Fire, but at the cost of disrupting the fundamental cycles that governed existence, creating conditions where death could no longer function according to its proper role in the cosmic scheme. Souls that should have been able to find peaceful rest after their mortal lives had ended, instead found themselves trapped in states of undeath, neither fully alive nor properly dead, existing in liminal conditions that caused suffering rather than providing the completion that endings were meant to offer. These undead beings served as living reminders of the price that had been paid to preserve the age, their cursed existence bearing witness to the distortions that resulted from attempts to maintain systems beyond their natural lifespan. They wandered the world in growing numbers, driven by hollow hunger for the humanity that the linking had disrupted, seeking in vain for the peace that had been denied them by the artificial prolonging of an age that should have been allowed to reach its natural conclusion. Yet the curse also served another purpose in the grand scheme that Gwyn had established through his sacrifice. For among the undead, there occasionally arose individuals whose strength and determination marked them as potential candidates for repeating the linking ritual. These chosen undead, as they came to be known, possessed the resilience necessary to survive the trials that led to the first flame, and the power needed to serve as fuel for its continued burning. The prophecy that surrounded these chosen individuals spoke not of glory or reward, but of sacrifice and duty, promising only that their souls would burn to preserve an age whose foundations had been shaken by the very act of preservation itself. They were called to follow in Gwyn's footsteps, to repeat his sacrifice in an endless cycle that could postpone but never prevent the flame's eventual extinction. The other lords who had witnessed Gwyn's transformation responded to the crisis in ways that reflected their own natures and understanding of the cosmic forces involved. The Witch of Izalith, driven by her deep love of fire and her determination to preserve the creative possibilities of the age, began her own desperate research into methods that might provide alternatives to the endless cycle of sacrifice that Gwyn had established. Her attempt to recreate the first flame through the application of her mastery of pyromancy represented a different approach to the same fundamental problem, seeking to solve the crisis through innovation and creation, rather than sacrifice and preservation. Yet her efforts would lead to consequences even more catastrophic than the undead curse, demonstrating the dangers inherent in any attempt to manipulate forces operating at such cosmic scales. Nito, with his profound understanding of natural cycles and the necessity of endings, had warned his fellow lords about the dangers of attempting to prevent the flame's natural decline. His wisdom regarding the proper relationship between beginning and ending, creation and destruction, had been ignored in the desperation of the moment, but the consequences of that ignoring would vindicate his warnings in ways that brought no satisfaction to his patient consciousness. The furtive pygmy, whose dark soul had given birth to humanity itself, remained largely separate from the grand schemes and desperate measures undertaken by his fellow lords. Yet the curse that now affected his human descendants was intimately connected to the nature of the dark soul and its relationship to the failing flame, suggesting roles and possibilities that would only become clear in the ages to come. The world that emerged from Gwyn's linking of the fire was simultaneously saved and doomed, preserved from immediate extinction yet condemned to an endless cycle of crisis and temporary reprieve. The Age of Fire would continue, sustained by the sacrifice of heroes who chose duty over survival, but it would never again possess the natural vitality and unlimited potential that had characterized its golden age. The flame burned on, fed by divine essence and maintained through conscious will, but it was no longer the same force that had once blazed with automatic confidence in its own eternity. It had become something more fragile and precious, requiring constant vigilance and repeated sacrifice to maintain its existence, dependent upon the continued willingness of heroes to follow Gwyn's example and offer their souls as fuel for its preservation. The age of innocence was over, replaced by an era of knowledge that was both blessing and curse. The lords and their subjects now understood the temporary nature of their existence and the price that must be paid to maintain it. Wisdom that brought with it responsibilities too heavy for any individual consciousness to bear alone. They had purchased continued existence through sacrifice, but they had also learned that even gods cannot escape the fundamental law that all flames, no matter how magnificent, must eventually consume all available fuel and fade into darkness. As the ages of fire matured and flourished, as the golden spires of Anor Londo reached ever higher toward heavens that blazed with divine radiance, and as the great civilizations built by gods and mortals alike achieved heights of beauty and wisdom that seemed destined to endure for all eternity, there began to manifest subtle changes that only the most perceptive observers could detect in the fundamental forces that sustained their magnificent world. The first flame, that cosmic fire from which all disparity and possibility had emerged in those distant days when hollow beings first approached its impossible radiance, continued to burn in the depths beneath the transformed earth. Yet its dance had begun to show variations so minute that they might have been dismissed as natural fluctuations in a force too vast and complex for complete mortal understanding, were it not for the growing consistency with which these changes appeared. The colors that swirled within the flame's dancing heart, once brilliant beyond description in their intensity and purity, had begun to show the faintest suggestion of dimming, as if some infinitesimal portion of their radiance was being held back or absorbed by forces that had not previously affected the flame's perfect expression. The rhythms that governed its pulsing, once as regular and eternal as the beating of some cosmic heart, now carried within them subtle irregularities that suggested processes of change occurring deep within the fire's essential nature. These alterations were so gradual and so slight that even the lords themselves, despite their intimate connection to the flame's power through their lord's souls, initially failed to recognize the true significance of what they were witnessing. The flame still provided more than adequate energy to sustain all the miracles and wonders of their age, still blazed with sufficient intensity to illuminate the darkest corners of existence, still pulsed with enough creative force to kindle new forms of life and possibility wherever its influence was felt. Yet the Witch of Izalith, whose deep understanding of fire's nature surpassed that of any other being in existence, began to perceive patterns within these changes that filled her with growing unease. Her countless ages of studying flame in all its forms had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that preceded more dramatic alterations in a fire's behavior, and what she saw in the first flame's evolving dance spoke of processes that could not be ignored indefinitely. The flame was consuming itself, burning through the fundamental disparity that had given it birth and sustained its existence across all the long ages since the hollow beings had first approached it in those deep caverns. Like any fire, no matter how magnificent or apparently inexhaustible, it required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel was finite in ways that had not been apparent during the intoxicating early days when every possibility seemed unlimited and every dream appeared achievable. The disparity itself, that precious quality of difference and change that had made the Age of Fire possible, was slowly being transformed and absorbed by the very flame that had created it. Each soul that drew power from the fire's radiance, each miracle that channeled its energy into wondrous effects, each manifestation of magic or divinity that depended upon its continued burning, all of these things consumed tiny portions of the essential difference that kept the flame alive. The mathematics of this consumption were inexorable in their implications. Though the process operated on such vast timescales, that its effects remained nearly invisible to beings accustomed to thinking in terms of mortal lifespans, or even the extended existence of divine consciousness. Yet when projected across the eons that would be required for the flame's complete exhaustion, the pattern became unmistakable. The first flame would eventually burn itself out entirely, consuming all available fuel until nothing remained but the grey uniformity from which it had originally emerged. The recognition of this approaching crisis forced the Lords to confront questions that struck at the very heart of everything they had built and achieved during the golden age of their civilization. If the flame that made their existence possible was destined to fade, what would become of the magnificent cities they had raised, the knowledge they had accumulated, the forms of life and consciousness that had never before existed in all the long history of creation? The implications of the flame's eventual extinction were catastrophic beyond imagination. For without its power to sustain the principle of disparity, the world would inevitably return to the grey stasis that had characterized the Age of Ancients. The dynamic forces of growth and change that had enabled such incredible achievements would cease to function, while all the complex forms of existence that depended upon the flame's energy would simply dissolve back into the undifferentiated void from which they had originally been shaped. Worse still was the realization that the flame's decline appeared to be accelerating as the Age of Fire progressed and matured. The more souls that drew upon its power, the more miracles that channeled its energy, the more complex and sophisticated the civilizations that depended upon its continued burning became, the faster the rate at which it consumed the disparity that sustained its existence. This acceleration created a cruel paradox that struck at the heart of everything the Lords had sought to accomplish. The very success of their age, the magnificent achievements and wondrous innovations that they had fostered and celebrated, was hastening the arrival of the crisis that would ultimately destroy everything they had worked to create. Each new discovery that expanded the applications of divine power, each advancement that made life more beautiful or meaningful, each soul that awakened to the possibilities offered by the Age of Fire, all of these victories carried within themselves the seeds of ultimate defeat. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, was among the first to fully grasp the implications of this approaching catastrophe, his divine consciousness illuminated by the same radiant power that allowed him to perceive the subtle changes occurring within the first flame itself. The prospect of watching his golden age fade into grey uniformity, of seeing the magnificent civilization he had built crumble into the eternal stasis of the ancient world, filled him with a determination that burned even brighter than his usual divine radiance. His response to the crisis was characteristically ambitious and decisive, reflecting the same commanding will that had enabled him to forge victory against the dragons and establish the foundations of divine civilization. If the first flame required fuel to continue burning, then he would provide that fuel through whatever means necessary, regardless of the personal cost or the sacrifices that might be demanded of him and those who served his cause. The solution he envisioned was as audacious as it was desperate. He would offer himself as fuel for the failing flame, feeding his own Lord's soul into its diminishing fire to provide the energy needed to sustain the Age of Fire for additional eons. His divine essence, accumulated across ages of rule and refined through countless acts of cosmic responsibility, contained enough power to serve as fuel for the flame's continued burning, at least for a time. Yet Gwyn understood that even this ultimate sacrifice would provide only a temporary reprieve from the inevitable crisis, postponing rather than preventing the flame's eventual extinction. His Lord's soul, no matter how powerful, was still finite in nature, and its consumption would merely grant the world additional ages of existence, rather than solving the fundamental problem of the flame's dependency upon limited resources. The knowledge that his sacrifice would be temporary, rather than permanent, added poignancy to his decision, for he was choosing to give up his divine existence for a reprieve whose duration could not be predicted with certainty. He might purchase decades or centuries or even millennia of continued existence for his age, but eventually even his magnificent essence would be consumed, leaving the world to face the same crisis he was attempting to forestall. The process by which a Lord's soul could be linked to the first flame as fuel for its continued burning was not something that could be accomplished through simple will or conventional magical techniques. It required a ritual of such complexity and power that it existed at the very boundaries of what was considered possible even in an age defined by wonders and miracles that defied normal understanding. The preparations for this unprecedented undertaking consumed the attention and resources of the finest minds in all of Anor Londo, divine intelligences that had never before been confronted with challenges of such cosmic scope and significance. The ritual they designed would transform the very nature of the first flame itself, changing it from a naturally occurring force into something that could be sustained through deliberate sacrifice and conscious intervention. The knowledge required for such a transformation drew upon every branch of learning that had been developed during the Age of Fire, combining insights from divine theology with practical understanding of magical processes, theoretical philosophy with engineering precision, artistic inspiration with mathematical rigor. The scholars and artificers who worked on the project were attempting to codify and implement procedures that had never before been attempted by any conscious intelligence. The location chosen for the ritual was the kiln of the first flame itself, that sacred chamber deep beneath the world where the original fire continued to burn in its ancient brazier. This was hallowed ground that had been touched by divinity since the very beginning of the Age of Fire, consecrated by proximity to the source of all disparity and possibility, sanctified by ages of providing the foundational energy that sustained all existence. The approach to the kiln required passage through territories that had been scarred by the flame's gradual decline, regions where the weakening of disparity had allowed portions of the ancient grey uniformity to begin reasserting themselves. These transitional areas served as stark reminders of what awaited the entire world if the flame were allowed to burn out completely. Landscapes where colour slowly faded back toward the monochrome perfection of eternal stasis. The guardians that protected the path to the kiln were not conventional sentries, but manifestations of the flame's own defensive mechanisms, beings of living fire and crystallized light that existed to prevent unauthorized access to the cosmic forces housed within. These entities challenged anyone who sought to approach the first flame, testing their worthiness through trials that demanded not only strength and skill, but also purity of purpose and absolute dedication to the preservation of the age. When Gwyn finally stood before the first flame in all its diminished but still magnificent glory, he understood with perfect clarity what his sacrifice would accomplish and what it would cost. The linking of his Lord's soul to the flame's essence would indeed provide the energy needed to sustain the Age of Fire for additional ages, but it would also fundamentally alter his own existence in ways that could never be reversed or undone. The ritual itself was both beautiful and terrible to witness, a cosmic transformation that operated on scales too vast for mortal comprehension, yet intimate enough to touch the very essence of individual consciousness. Gwyn's divine form began to merge with the flame itself, his golden radiance becoming indistinguishable from the fire's own light as his Lord's soul was gradually absorbed into the cosmic forces that sustained all disparity. The process was not simply destructive but transformative, changing both the Lord of Sunlight and the first flame in ways that created something entirely new, a hybrid entity that possessed characteristics of both divine consciousness and cosmic force, capable of deliberate action yet bound to the eternal task of maintaining the conditions necessary for the Age of Fire's continued existence. Yet even as Gwyn's sacrifice restored the flame to something approaching its original vitality, even as the renewed radiance began to flow outward from the kiln to revitalize the magic and miracles that depended upon its power, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The flame still required fuel to continue burning, and that fuel would eventually be exhausted regardless of how carefully it was managed or how efficiently it was used. The linking of the fire had established a precedent and created a mechanism through which the crisis could be repeatedly postponed, but it had not eliminated the underlying issue that threatened the long-term survival of the age. Future heroes would need to repeat Gwyn's sacrifice when his essence was finally consumed, offering their own souls as fuel for the flame's continued burning in an endless cycle of noble self-destruction. The curse of undeath that began to manifest throughout the mortal populations of the world was not, as many believed, a random affliction or a punishment for some forgotten transgression. Instead, it was a direct consequence of the imbalances created by Gwyn's linking of the fire, a symptom of the artificial nature of the flame's continued existence and the distortions this created in the natural order of life and death. The linking had preserved the Age of Fire, but at the cost of disrupting the fundamental cycles that governed existence, creating conditions where death could no longer function according to its proper role in the cosmic scheme. Souls that should have been able to find peaceful rest after their mortal lives had ended, instead found themselves trapped in states of undeath, neither fully alive nor properly dead, existing in liminal conditions that caused suffering, rather than providing the completion that endings were meant to offer. These undead beings served as living reminders of the price that had been paid to preserve the age, their cursed existence bearing witness to the distortions that resulted from attempts to maintain systems beyond their natural lifespan. They wandered the world in growing numbers, driven by hollow hunger for the humanity that the linking had disrupted, seeking in vain for the peace that had been denied them by the artificial prolonging of an age that should have been allowed to reach its natural conclusion. Yet the curse also served another purpose in the grand scheme that Gwyn had established through his sacrifice. For among the undead, there occasionally arose individuals whose strength and determination marked them as potential candidates for repeating the linking ritual. These chosen undead, as they came to be known, possessed the resilience necessary to survive the trials that led to the first flame and the power needed to serve as fuel for its continued burning. The prophecy that surrounded these chosen individuals spoke not of glory or reward, but of sacrifice and duty, promising only that their souls would burn to preserve an age whose foundations had been shaken by the very act of preservation itself. They were called to follow in Gwyn's footsteps, to repeat his sacrifice in an endless cycle that could postpone but never prevent the flame's eventual extinction. The other lords who had witnessed Gwyn's transformation responded to the crisis in ways that reflected their own natures and understanding of the cosmic forces involved. The Witch of Izalith, driven by her deep love of fire and her determination to preserve the creative possibilities of the age, began her own desperate research into methods that might provide alternatives to the endless cycle of sacrifice that Gwyn had established. Her attempt to recreate the first flame through the application of her mastery of pyromancy represented a different approach to the same fundamental problem, seeking to solve the crisis through innovation and creation, rather than sacrifice and preservation. Yet her efforts would lead to consequences even more catastrophic than the undead curse, demonstrating the dangers inherent in any attempt to manipulate forces operating at such cosmic scales. Nito, with his profound understanding of natural cycles and the necessity of endings, had warned his fellow lords about the dangers of attempting to prevent the flame's natural decline. His wisdom regarding the proper relationship between beginning and ending, creation and destruction, had been ignored in the desperation of the moment. But the consequences of that ignoring would vindicate his warnings in ways that brought no satisfaction to his patient consciousness. The furtive pygmy, whose dark soul had given birth to humanity itself, remained largely separate from the grand schemes and desperate measures undertaken by his fellow lords. Yet the curse that now affected his human descendants was intimately connected to the nature of the dark soul and its relationship to the failing flame, suggesting roles and possibilities that would only become clear in the ages to come. The world that emerged from Gwyn's linking of the fire was simultaneously saved and doomed, preserved from immediate extinction, yet condemned to an endless cycle of crisis and temporary reprieve. The Age of Fire would continue, sustained by the sacrifice of heroes who chose duty over survival, but it would never again possess the natural vitality and unlimited potential that had characterized its golden age. The flame burned on, fed by divine essence and maintained through conscious will. But it was no longer the same force that had once blazed with automatic confidence in its own eternity. It had become something more fragile and precious, requiring constant vigilance and repeated sacrifice to maintain its existence, dependent upon the continued willingness of heroes to follow Gwyn's example and offer their souls as fuel for its preservation. The Age of Innocence was over, replaced by an era of knowledge that was both blessing and curse. The lords and their subjects now understood the temporary nature of their existence and the price that must be paid to maintain it, wisdom that brought with it responsibilities too heavy for any individual consciousness to bear alone. They had purchased continued existence through sacrifice, but they had also learned that even gods cannot escape the fundamental law that all flames, no matter how magnificent, must eventually consume all available fuel and fade into darkness. In the ages that followed Gwyn's supreme sacrifice, when the Lord of Sunlight had offered his divine essence as fuel for the failing first flame, and established the precedent for the endless cycle of linking that would define all subsequent eras, the world that emerged from this cosmic transformation bore within itself both the seeds of continued greatness and the persistent shadows of inevitable decline. The immediate effect of the linking had been dramatic and seemingly miraculous, restoring vitality to magical systems that had begun to weaken and breathing new life into civilizations that had started to show the subtle signs of entropy that accompanied the flame's gradual dimming. Yet this restoration came at a cost that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence in ways that none of the original architects of the Age of Fire could have fully anticipated or prepared for. The legacy of the Four Lords echoed through every aspect of the world they had left behind, their influences woven so deeply into the fabric of reality that their presence could be felt even by those who had never heard their names or understood the cosmic forces they had once commanded. Each lord had contributed essential elements to the foundation upon which all subsequent civilization would be built, their individual natures and achievements becoming integral parts of the inherited wisdom that guided later generations. Gwyn's legacy was perhaps the most visible and immediate, for his sacrifice had not only preserved the Age of Fire, but had also established the philosophical and spiritual framework that would govern how future societies understood their relationship to cosmic forces. The concept of noble sacrifice in service of the greater good, the ideal of leadership through example rather than mere authority, the understanding that even divine power carried with it responsibilities that transcended personal desires. All of these principles had been demonstrated through his ultimate act of linking the fire. The Way of White, which had begun as Gwyn's attempt to spread divine wisdom throughout mortal communities, evolved in the aftermath of his sacrifice into something far more complex and profound. No longer simply a religious organization dedicated to the worship of light and order, it became a comprehensive philosophical system that addressed the fundamental questions of existence in an age where the temporary nature of all things had been starkly revealed. The clerics and scholars who carried forward this tradition found themselves serving not merely as spiritual guides, but as counselors and teachers who helped communities navigate the psychological challenges that came with the knowledge of their world's precarious situation. The understanding that their age persisted only through repeated sacrifice, that their continued existence depended upon heroes willing to offer their souls for the preservation of the flame, created existential anxieties that required new forms of wisdom to address. The miracles that these clerics performed retained their power and effectiveness, drawing energy from the renewed flame to accomplish feats of healing and protection that served the immediate needs of their communities. Yet these same miracles also served as constant reminders of the artificial nature of their world's continued existence, each successful channeling of divine power representing a tiny portion of the fuel that would eventually be consumed to maintain the flames burning. The architectural legacy of Anor Londo continued to inspire builders and artists throughout the known world, though few possessed the divine power or cosmic understanding necessary to replicate the most magnificent achievements of the Golden Age. The principles of design and construction that had been developed in the City of the Gods found expression in countless mortal settlements, creating a visual continuity that linked later civilizations to the divine precedents established by Gwyn and his court. Yet these later constructions, no matter how skillfully crafted or aesthetically pleasing, lacked the transcendent quality that had characterized the original divine architecture. They were beautiful echoes of something greater, rather than expressions of divine consciousness made manifest in stone and crystal, serving as reminders of what had been achieved in the past, rather than promises of what might be accomplished in the future. The Witch of Izalith's influence on the post-linking world was more complex and tragic, for her attempted recreation of the first flame had resulted not in salvation but in the birth of the Chaos Flame and the transformation of her domain into a realm of demons and corruption. Yet, even this catastrophic failure had contributed essential knowledge to the accumulated wisdom of the age, demonstrating through terrible example the dangers inherent in attempting to manipulate cosmic forces beyond complete understanding. The pyromantic arts that had originated in her laboratories continued to be studied and practiced throughout the world, though always with the sobering awareness of what had happened to their original creators. The techniques and principles she had developed retained their effectiveness and beauty, allowing later practitioners to channel the creative power of flame in ways that could accomplish wonders of both practical utility and artistic expression. The scholars who studied her work and attempted to understand the precise mechanisms that had led to her transformation made discoveries that proved invaluable for preventing similar disasters in other areas of magical research. Her failure, in its very completeness and visibility, served as a cautionary tale that guided future generations away from the specific errors that had led to such catastrophic consequences. More profoundly, the witch's fate served as a powerful reminder of the dangers inherent in attempting to solve cosmic problems through individual action, no matter how noble the intentions or how great the personal sacrifice involved. Her love for fire and her desire to preserve the creative possibilities of the Age of Fire had driven her to attempt innovations that exceeded the safe boundaries of even divine capability, demonstrating that good intentions alone were insufficient protection against the consequences of overreaching ambition. The demons that had been born from her transformation continued to inhabit the ruins of Izalith, serving as living monuments to the tragedy that had befallen their creator, while also representing forms of existence that had never before been possible. These creatures, born from the union of divine power with uncontrolled chaos, possessed qualities that defied easy categorization, being neither fully alive nor truly dead, neither completely chaotic nor entirely ordered. Some scholars who studied the demons found in their strange nature insights that proved valuable for understanding the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between order and chaos, creation and destruction, intention and consequence. The demons served as examples of what could emerge when cosmic forces were allowed to operate without the constraints normally imposed by natural law, providing glimpses into possibilities that existed at the very edges of conceivable existence. Nito's legacy was perhaps the most subtle, but also the most essential, for his deep understanding of natural cycles and the necessity of endings continued to provide wisdom that was crucial for maintaining balance in a world increasingly dominated by attempts to prevent or postpone natural transitions. His patient acceptance of mortality and change offered a counterpoint to the desperate preservation efforts that characterized much of the post-linking era. The necromantic arts that had developed under his guidance evolved into sophisticated systems for understanding and working with the processes of death and transformation that remained active even in the artificially prolonged age of 12 age. Fire. These techniques proved especially valuable for addressing the undead curse that had emerged as a consequence of the linking, providing methods for helping cursed individuals find some measure of peace even when complete healing was impossible. The philosophical perspectives that Nito had contributed to the collective wisdom of the Lords. His insights into the proper relationship between beginning and ending. His understanding of death as completion rather than failure. His recognition of the necessity of change for maintaining cosmic health became increasingly relevant as the world struggled to adapt to its altered circumstances. His tomb continued to serve as a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of existence, though few who made the journey possessed the wisdom or spiritual preparation necessary to fully grasp the lessons that could be learned there. The peaceful chambers, where souls had once found natural rest, now served as repositories of ancient wisdom regarding the proper conduct of endings, knowledge that remained relevant even in an age where natural death had been disrupted by cosmic intervention. The influence of the furtive pygmy was perhaps the most pervasive yet least understood of all the Lord's legacies, for humanity itself represented his contribution to the world's development. The dark soul that had given birth to the human race continued to shape the nature and destiny of mortals in ways that were only beginning to be understood as the implications of the linking became apparent. Humans possessed a unique relationship to the cosmic forces that governed their world, being neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, but occupying a middle ground that granted them unusual flexibility and adaptability. This intermediate status made them particularly well suited to serve as bridges between different realms of existence, capable of learning from divine wisdom while remaining grounded in mortal experience. The curse of undeath that had emerged following the linking affected humans more profoundly than other forms of life, but it also revealed aspects of human nature that had not been apparent during the golden age of the original Age of Fire. The resilience that allowed some humans to maintain their sanity and purpose even while cursed. The determination that drove certain individuals to seek solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The capacity for growth and change that enabled adaptation to radically altered circumstances. All of these qualities spoke to the unique nature of beings shaped by the dark soul. The prophecy of the chosen undead that began to circulate throughout human communities represented both hope and burden, promising that solutions to the world's problems might emerge from among humanity's ranks, while also suggesting that such solutions would require sacrifices that few were prepared to make. The concept of being chosen for such a destiny carried with it implications that were simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. The communities that humans established throughout the post-linking world demonstrated remarkable adaptability to changed circumstances, developing new forms of social organization and cultural expression that reflected their altered understanding of existence's temporary nature. These societies showed greater appreciation for immediate experience and present relationships, recognizing that nothing could be taken for granted in an age where continuity itself required constant effort to maintain. The arts that flourished in human settlements reflected themes of heroism and sacrifice, beauty and transience, hope and melancholy that captured the complex emotional landscape of existence in a world balanced between preservation and decline. Their music carried haunting melodies that spoke of loss and longing, while their literature explored the psychological depths of characters facing impossible choices between personal happiness and cosmic responsibility. The philosophical schools that emerged from human thinkers grappled with questions that had never before needed to be addressed, attempting to understand the meaning of existence in circumstances where the fundamental nature of reality had been altered by divine intervention. These intellectual traditions would prove invaluable for preparing future generations to face the recurring crises that had become an inherent part of their world's structure. As the ages progressed following the linking, the signs that had originally prompted Gwyn's sacrifice began to reappear with increasing frequency and intensity. The first flame, sustained now by divine essence rather than its original natural processes, showed patterns of consumption that suggested the temporary nature of even this ultimate solution to the cosmic crisis. The prophecy that began to take shape during this period spoke of bells that would need to be rung when the time came for a new linking, signals that would summon a chosen undead, capable of repeating Gwyn's sacrifice and providing fresh fuel for the flame's continued burning. These prophecies served both as sources of hope and as reminders of the cyclical nature of the crisis that now defined their world's existence. The preparation for this eventual calling involved the establishment of trials and challenges that could test potential heroes, ensuring that only those with the strength and determination necessary for such an ultimate sacrifice would be permitted to approach the first flame. These trials drew upon the accumulated wisdom of all the lords, combining tests of martial prowess with examinations of moral character and spiritual development. The keepers of these traditions understood that they were maintaining systems designed to identify and prepare individuals for the most difficult choice any conscious being could be asked to make: the voluntary surrender of personal existence for the sake of cosmic preservation. The weight of this responsibility influenced every aspect of how these institutions developed and operated. Yet even as preparations were made for the continuation of the linking cycle, questions began to arise regarding the ultimate wisdom and sustainability of this approach to the cosmic crisis. Some scholars and philosophers suggested that the repeated linking might be creating distortions in the natural order that could eventually lead to consequences more severe than allowing the flame to reach its natural end. These dissenting voices raised uncomfortable questions about whether the preservation of the Age of Fire justified the suffering caused by the undead curse, whether the artificial prolonging of cosmic systems created imbalances that might ultimately prove more destructive than the alternative, whether there might be other solutions to the crisis that had not yet been explored or understood. The debate between preservation and acceptance, between fighting against cosmic cycles and working with them, between maintaining familiar forms of existence and allowing new forms to emerge, would continue to shape philosophical and political discourse throughout the remaining ages of fire. These discussions reflected the profound complexity of questions that had no clear answers, choices that carried consequences too vast for complete comprehension. The world that would eventually face the next great crisis was one that had been fundamentally shaped by the legacy of the Four Lords and their responses to the challenges of their age, their wisdom and their failures, their achievements and their tragedies, their individual natures and their collective vision had created the foundation upon which all subsequent history would unfold. The chosen undead, who would eventually answer the call of prophecy, would do so as inheritors of this complex legacy, carrying within themselves the accumulated experience and understanding of all who had come before. Their choices would determine not only the immediate fate of their world, but also the direction of cosmic development for ages yet to come. The bells would ring when the time was right, their sound carrying across a world that bore the marks of divine ambition and cosmic responsibility in equal measure. The story of the Four Lords would reach its conclusion through the actions of heroes who had learned from their example, understood their sacrifices, and chosen to continue the cycle they had established through their own supreme acts of courage and dedication. And so we reach the end of our journey through the Age of Fire, where four beings of immense power shaped the destiny of all existence through their choices, their sacrifices, and their failures. The Lords of Cinder burn eternal in memory, their legacies woven into the very fabric of a world that continues to struggle between light and shadow, fire and dark. As you drift toward your own peaceful darkness, remember that every ending is also a beginning. Every flame that fades leaves embers that might one day ignite anew. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. In your dreams, perhaps you'll walk those ancient halls, hear the echo of Gwyn's footsteps in Anorlondo, feel the warmth of Izalith before its corruption, stand in the solemn presence of Nito in his tomb. Sleep now, and let the bonfire's gentle light guide you to rest. The Lords have told their tale, and yours can wait until dawn returns to chase away the comfortable dark. May your dreams be filled with the peace that even gods sought but could never quite achieve.